Tonight, we are not beginning with kings. There will be no jeweled crowns waiting for us, no cavalry charging through the mist, and no stone castle looming dramatically over a frightened village. Instead, our story begins with grass. Not even particularly impressive grass, the sort of plant you might pass without noticing while looking for something more interesting. And yet this quiet plant will eventually help feed cities, sustain empires, cross oceans, reshape landscapes, and find its way into corners of modern life that its earliest growers could never have imagined. So get comfortable, dim the lights a little, settle into whatever chair or bed has carried you through the day, and allow the room around you to become quiet. If you enjoy these long journeys into the stranger corners of history, you can subscribe or leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from. There is no hurry. Tonight, history has waited thousands of years for us already, and our journey begins in what is now Mexico. Long before Columbus sees the Caribbean, long before Europeans know that an enormous pair of continents lies beyond the Atlantic, and long before anyone can stand in a supermarket aisle beneath bright lights and choose between several kinds of corn. The land is warm, dust clings to bare feet, smoke rises from cooking fires and hangs beneath simple roofs. Somewhere nearby, stone strikes stone with a patient scraping sound as grain is crushed for food. The air carries the smell of earth, ash, vegetation, and something roasting close to the fire. Beyond the settlement grow plants that would seem strangely unimpressive to modern eyes. One of them is teosinte. If someone placed teosinte beside a modern ear of corn, the relationship might seem like a joke. Modern corn has a thick cob crowded with soft, exposed kernels arranged in neat rows. Teosinte looks leaner and wilder. Its seed cases are hard, its useful portions are small. There is no great golden ear waiting to be boiled, roasted, buttered, or ground into flour. It is, at first glance, a poor candidate for changing the world. But the people living here are not searching for plants that will impress someone thousands of years in the future. They are watching what grows around them. They know seasons through experience rather than printed calendars. They understand which patches of soil hold moisture longer, which plants endure dry weather, which seeds ripen well, and which foods are worth the labor required to gather and prepare them. And somewhere within this long relationship between people and landscape, a quiet decision is made. Then it is made again and again. A family gathers seeds. Some plants have useful traits. Perhaps their kernels are slightly larger. Perhaps the seed cases are a little easier to work with. Perhaps one plant produces more food than another. Seeds from desirable plants are kept. The next season they are planted. There is nothing dramatic about this. No one announces that agriculture has entered a new age. No priest climbs a pyramid to declare that the future of world food has just changed. No historian sits nearby recording the moment. There are simply hands gathering. Hands sorting, hands planting, hands waiting. Then another generation does the same. This is one of the most beautiful problems in ancient history. We often want important things to have beginnings that feel important. We imagine a clever inventor staring at a plant and suddenly understanding what must be done. We like discoveries with names attached to them. We like moments that can be carved neatly into a timeline. Corn refuses to give us that satisfaction. There is no single morning when humanity discovers corn as we know it. Human beings help create it, not from nothing, of course. Nature provides the living material, the variation, the soil, the rain, and the stubborn little ancestor growing beneath the Mesoamerican sun. But generation after generation, farmers become part of the plant's evolution. By choosing particular seeds and planting them again, they gradually favor characteristics useful to human communities. The changes accumulate so slowly that no single farmer needs to understand the final result. Imagine a woman sitting near a fire at the end of a long day. Her fingers are rough from work. Beside her lies a small collection of seeds saved for planting. She chooses carefully. She has no idea that people in distant lands will one day argue about corn prices, feed cattle with corn, turn corn into sweeteners, ferment it, distill it, process it in factories, and plant it across landscapes she cannot imagine. She is thinking about the next season. Perhaps she is thinking about her children. Perhaps she simply knows that this seed came from a better plant. That is enough. History can move on very small decisions. Year after year, the plants begin to change. Human preference becomes an invisible pressure. Plants with favorable traits are more likely to have their seeds planted near settlements. Those seeds produce another generation. The relationship deepens. And there is something almost strange about the bargain taking shape. Wild plants normally scatter their own seeds. They do not require a farmer to carry those seeds into prepared soil. But the ancestor of cultivated maize is slowly transformed into something increasingly suited to human use and increasingly dependent upon human hands. The plant becomes better food, and in doing so it becomes less independent. Human beings are domesticating corn, but corn is also beginning to attach itself to human survival. Neither side can know how far this arrangement will go. For the moment, there are only fields beneath a hot sky. Morning arrives with work. Soil must be prepared, seeds must be placed, weeds must be controlled, rain must come at the right time, or at least close enough to the right time. Animals may eat young plants. Storms may flatten them, dry weather may turn hope into dust. Agriculture is never simply planting and waiting. It is a long conversation with uncertainty. When the harvest succeeds, the work changes rather than ends. Food must be gathered and stored, kernels must be processed. Stone tools grind against grain with a rhythm that becomes part of domestic life. Smoke stains walls and roofs. Children grow up hearing the sounds of preparation before they are old enough to understand how much labor stands between a seed and a meal. This is how corn enters human history, not as a commodity, not as a global crop, not as a symbol on a package, as work, as patience, as food beside a fire. And then it begins to travel, not quickly, at least not by the standards of the modern world. There are no freight trains, cargo ships, refrigerated trucks, or highways. A seed travels because a person carries it. A family moves, traders exchange goods, neighbors learn from neighbors, communities meet. Knowledge follows paths through valleys and across highlands. Different environments demand different varieties. The plant changes with them. In warmer lowlands, one form may thrive. At higher elevations, another may be better suited to cooler conditions. Farmers continue selecting. The crop becomes not one simple thing, but a collection of forms shaped by local climates, local needs, and local knowledge. Centuries pass, then more centuries. Villages grow, settlements become larger, political centers rise, ceremonies become more elaborate. Trade routes stretch farther. People build temples, carve stone, observe the heavens, wage wars, raise families, tell stories, bury their dead, and prepare meals. Through all of this, maize remains close. By the time great Mesoamerican societies flourish, maize is no longer merely an unusual descendant of wild grass. It has become one of the foundations beneath civilization itself, and that changes the meaning of the plant. A crop that feeds a household is useful. A crop that helps support towns and cities becomes powerful. When food can be produced reliably enough, some members of society can spend more time doing things other than finding food. Crafts become more specialized, markets expand, religious institutions grow, rulers command labor, builders raise monuments. None of this means maize alone creates civilization. Human societies are far too complicated for such a simple explanation. Beans, squash, chilies, other foods, trade, water management, political organization, labor, and local ecology all matter. But maize becomes a steady presence beneath much of the story, a quiet yellow thread running through daily life. And it does not travel alone. Knowledge travels with it. Farmers learn when to plant. Cooks learn how to prepare it. Families learn how to store it. Communities develop traditions around it. The plant moves from field to kitchen, from kitchen to ceremony, and from ceremony into stories about what human beings are and where they belong. In some Mesoamerican traditions, maize is more than something people eat. It becomes part of how people imagine humanity itself. This should not surprise us as much as it sometimes does. People tend to build meaning around whatever keeps them alive. For a fishing community, the sea can become sacred. For pastoral people, cattle may become woven into wealth, identity, marriage, and ritual. For agricultural societies, the cycle of planting and harvest can become a way of understanding death and return. A dry kernel disappears beneath dark soil. For a time, Nothing seems to happen. Then a green shoot rises. It is easy to understand why people watching this happen generation after generation might see something larger than agriculture in it. Life vanishes beneath the earth and comes back changed. The field becomes a calendar. Planting announces one season. Growth marks another. Harvest changes the rhythm of work. Storage determines how comfortably a household can face the months ahead. The crop measures time without needing a clock, and every successful harvest contains a quiet warning. There must be another. The dependence is now mutual enough to be felt. People tend maize because they need it. Maize survives and spreads because people tend it. But there's another piece of the story, one that will become extraordinarily important when corn eventually crosses the ocean. The ancient growers of maize do not merely learn how to cultivate the plant. They learn how to eat it properly. In kitchens across Mesoamerica, dried maize can be cooked in an alkaline solution, traditionally involving substances such as lime or ash. The process is known today as nixtamalization. The word may sound technical, but the scene itself is wonderfully ordinary. There is a pot, there is water, there is maize, there is knowledge passed from one person to another. The treatment changes the grain. It helps loosen the outer covering and makes the maize easier to grind. It changes flavor and texture. More importantly, though, no ancient cook needs the vocabulary of modern nutritional science to explain it. The process makes important nutrients more available to the human body. The people doing this do not need a laboratory. They have something older, accumulated experience. Someone learns what works. Someone teaches a daughter, a son, a neighbor, an apprentice, or another member of the household. The method survives because meals prepared this way are part of ordinary life. That ordinary knowledge will matter enormously because much later, strangers will arrive. They will see maize, they will admire how productive it can be. They will carry it across an ocean. They will plant it in distant soil. But carrying a seed is easier than carrying an entire culture of knowledge. For now, however, that future is far away. The Atlantic remains beyond the horizon of this story. Europe continues with its wheat, rye, barley, oats, wars, harvests, famines, monasteries, markets, and quarrels. In places such as London, York, Canterbury, Normandy, Flanders, and Edinburgh, people live and die without knowing that maize exists. Meanwhile, across Mesoamerica, maize continues its patient work. At dawn, people walk into fields. At midday, heat settles over the earth. At evening, smoke rises again. Grinding stones wear smooth under repeated use. Meals are shared, seeds are saved. Children watch adults work and eventually become the adults doing the work themselves. The transformation continues so gradually that it almost disappears inside daily life. This is one reason the history of food can feel so intimate. Kings may change borders in an afternoon. Armies may destroy a town in a day. But food changes humanity through repetition. A meal eaten once is dinner. A meal eaten by millions of people across generations becomes history. Maize begins to shape settlement, labor, trade, ritual, and memory. It becomes familiar enough to be taken for granted, and there may be no greater sign of a food's success than that. The extraordinary plant becomes ordinary. That is where its true power lies. Nobody wakes each morning astonished that grain exists. They simply need breakfast, and so the crop spreads farther. Seeds move northward and southward through networks of exchange and migration. Communities adapt maize to new environments. Farmers continue selecting plants suited to their own conditions. The descendants of teosinte take on an astonishing variety of colors, sizes, textures, and growing habits. White kernels, yellow kernels, red, blue, dark purple, soft forms and hard forms. Plants suited to different soils and seasons. There is no single uniform corn marching across the Americas. There are many local relationships between people and plant. Behind each variety lie generations of choices. This is easy to forget when looking at a modern field where row after row appears almost identical. Ancient agriculture can seem primitive when viewed from a distance, simply because it lacks engines and chemical factories. But there is deep intelligence here. A farmer does not need to know the language of genetics to understand inheritance. The best seed comes from somewhere. Certain traits return. Some plants survive conditions that kill others. Save those seeds. Plant them, watch, remember, repeat. It is science before the laboratory coat, experimentation before the printed paper, and record keeping stored partly in memory. Practice, tradition, and the seed itself. And this knowledge is not merely about producing more. It is about survival. A failed harvest is not an inconvenient statistic. It can mean hunger. A good harvest is not simply profit. It is winter food, security, celebration, and the possibility that children will see another planting season. That reality gives every seed a weight that is difficult to feel in a world where food can appear on shelves overnight. For ancient communities, the field is never far from the stomach, nor is the weather. Clouds matter. Rain matters, insects matter, soil matters, timing matters. The gods, spirits, ceremonies, and stories surrounding agriculture emerge within this world of uncertainty. Ritual is not separate from practical life, it sits beside it. People work the soil with their hands and seek meaning in forces they cannot control. The maize plant stands at the meeting point. Earth below, rain above, human labor between them. And as generations pass, the plant becomes so deeply woven into Mesoamerican life that separating food from culture becomes almost impossible. Maize can appear in tribute and trade. It can support crowded settlements. It can be prepared in different forms and eaten by people from different levels of society. It can enter religious thought and domestic routine at the same time. The sacred and the ordinary share the same grain. A person might encounter maize in ceremony and then return home to encounter it again in supper. There is something wonderfully human about that. People have always been capable of treating the same object as both profound and completely normal. And beneath all of this is the forgotten ancestor, teosinte, the scraggly grass that would barely attract a modern glance. Its descendants now stand in cultivated fields because countless people, most of whose names are lost forever, made countless small decisions. This may be the first great trick corn plays on history. It looks inevitable only after the work has been done. Modern eyes see a large ear of corn and assume that nature simply provides such things. But nature did not hand humanity the modern cob exactly as it appears today. It emerged through a partnership lasting generations. The farmer shaped the crop. The crop helped shape the farmer's world. And eventually that partnership grew large enough to support societies whose cities, rituals, markets, and political systems astonished the outsiders who later encountered them. Those outsiders, however, would notice the plant for reasons of their own. They would see that maize could grow abundantly. They would see food where their ancestors had never seen food before. They would collect the strange kernels and carry them toward wooden ships waiting on unfamiliar shores. And in that moment, something subtle would be lost. The newcomers could carry maize, they could carry sacks of seed, they could describe its appearance, they could plant it in European soil. But the plant was only half of the inheritance. The other half lived in hands, kitchens, memory, custom, and knowledge. It lived in the quiet preparation of grain beside a fire. It lived in the understanding that food is not simply what grows. Food is also what people learn to do with what grows. That distinction will eventually cost lives. But not yet, for now evening settles over Mesoamerica. The fields darken beneath the fading sky. Cooking fires glow inside homes. Somewhere, maize softens in a pot. Somewhere else, kernels are ground against stone. A farmer sets aside seed from a plant that performed particularly well, perhaps without giving the act much thought. The seed waits. It has already traveled an extraordinary distance through time. Soon its descendants will travel across an ocean. They will feed strangers who do not know the names of the people who shaped them. They will enter villages where nobody knows the old methods of preparation. They will become food for the poor, feed for animals, fuel for industry, and eventually ingredients hidden inside products that do not resemble a plant at all. But tonight, none of that has happened. Tonight, there is only a field, a cooking fire, and a handful of seed saved for another season. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson hidden at the beginning of corn's long history. Civilizations are not always changed by the things that arrive with trumpets. Sometimes the world changes because someone kneels in warm soil, chooses one seed instead of another, covers it with earth, and trusts that the rain will come. Let us leave the warm fields behind and follow the grain toward colder seas. For thousands of years, maize has moved through the Americas at the pace of human feet, canoes, trade routes, marriages, migrations, and memory. Seeds pass from one community to another. Farmers reshape them for different soils. Cooks learn what heat, water, lime, ash, and patient grinding can do. By the time European sails appear on the horizon, maize is already ancient. It has been cultivated for longer than many kingdoms have existed. It has fed generations whose names have vanished, supported cities, entered ceremonies, and become so familiar that no one needs to explain why it matters. Then, late in the 15th century, unfamiliar ships arrive in the Caribbean. To the people already living there, the newcomers must have seemed strange enough. Their clothes, their weapons, their animals, their language, even their smells belonged to another world. To the Europeans stepping ashore, the islands were equally bewildering. Almost everything invited comparison with something they already knew. Trees were judged against European trees. Birds were described through familiar birds. Foods were compared with familiar grains and fruits. The mind, when confronted with a new world, tends to rummage through the old one for labels. Among the plants the newcomers encounter is maize. They do not yet understand that this ordinary-looking crop will become one of the most important things carried back across the Atlantic. They are looking for other things. Gold has a way of attracting attention. A yellow kernel does not shine quite as persuasively as a yellow piece of metal. The voyages associated with Christopher Columbus belong to a larger and darker transformation than the simple story of adventurous sailors finding unfamiliar shores. Europeans are entering lands already inhabited by complex societies. Their arrival brings conquest, forced labor, violence, disease, religious upheaval, and enormous demographic catastrophe. At the same time, plants, animals, foods, microbes, and technologies begin moving between hemispheres on a scale never seen before. Historians later give this movement a tidy name, the Columbian Exchange. There is nothing tidy about living through it. Imagine a wooden ship rocking at anchor beneath a Caribbean sky. The deck smells of salt, tar, damp rope, sweat, old wood, and provisions that have spent too long below deck. Sailors complain, someone is repairing something. Someone is always repairing something on a wooden ship. Barrels are shifted. Water is guarded carefully. Food is inspected with the gloomy suspicion of men who know that a biscuit can contain more insects than anyone would willingly count. And somewhere among the objects being examined, traded, collected, or loaded aboard are unfamiliar seeds. Maize does not receive a royal cabin. No guard stands beside it with a sword. It is not wrapped in velvet. It does not require a locked chest. It simply comes aboard. That quiet entrance is almost comical when we know what follows. European observers are curious about the crop because it is clearly useful. Indigenous communities cultivate it deliberately and prepare it in many ways. It grows in fields rather than appearing as some rare botanical curiosity hidden deep in a forest. That alone makes it interesting. Sailors and colonists understand grain. Europe itself depends heavily on grain. Bread, porridge, ale, and countless ordinary meals begin with plants that produce storable calories. So when Europeans see maize, they do not need to understand its entire cultural history to recognize a useful possibility. Here is something people eat. Here is something people plant. Here is something that can be dried. Here is something whose seed can be carried. That last quality matters enormously. A ripe fruit may rot on a voyage. A prepared dish disappears when eaten. A living animal requires food, water, space, and luck. A dry seed can sleep. It can lie in a sack in the darkness of a ship while waves strike the hull. It can cross salt water without understanding that continents are changing around it. It can survive the arguments of sailors, storms, spoiled provisions, and weeks of damp misery. Then it can be planted in foreign soil. Maize is wonderfully suited to this new age of movement. The people carrying it do not yet know how far it will go. When the ships turn eastward, the Atlantic becomes a barrier that must be crossed again. The voyage back to Europe is long enough for novelty to become routine. Sailors grow tired of almost everything. The sea stretches from horizon to horizon. Day after day, clothes become stiff with salt. Wood creaks at night. Men sleep badly. The ship rises and falls. Below deck, among the cargo, the seeds wait. There is a strange contrast here. Europeans dream of wealth flowing west to east. Gold and silver will eventually cross the Atlantic in quantities capable of altering economies and financing wars. Precious metals will occupy kings, merchants, bankers, pirates, and tax collectors. Yet some of the most important cargoes will be alive: potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, peppers, maize, and in the other direction will travel wheat, sugarcane, horses, cattle, pigs, and many other organisms. Diseases will travel too, with consequences far more terrible than anyone aboard these early ships understands. The Atlantic is becoming less of a wall and more of a road. It is a dangerous road, a violent road. But once it opens, plants begin to move with astonishing persistence. Maize reaches Europe. At first, it is an outsider that matters. Europe already possesses deeply rooted food cultures. Wheat carries status in many places. Rye and barley tolerate conditions where wheat struggles. Oats belong naturally to colder landscapes and familiar diets. Bread itself has religious, social, and emotional meaning. A foreign grain does not simply arrive and erase centuries of habit, nor does maize immediately sweep across every field. New crops must be tested. Farmers must decide whether they trust them. Landowners must decide whether they are worth planting. Cooks must discover what to do with them. Markets must develop. And ordinary people, perhaps most importantly, must be willing to put the result into their mouths. Still, maize has advantages that are difficult to ignore. It grows well in many warm parts of southern Europe. Under suitable conditions, it can produce impressive amounts of food. It can be used to feed people, but it can also feed animals. It does not need to replace every familiar crop to become valuable. It can enter the agricultural system through gaps, marginal opportunities, and local experiments. A farmer does not need to care that the plant came from another hemisphere. He cares whether it grows. Picture a small field somewhere on the Iberian Peninsula. The seed goes into soil that has never held its ancestors before. Rain falls. The sun warms the ground. A green shoot emerges. There is no dramatic music. No crowd gathers. The plant simply grows, and that may be the moment when the conquest quietly reverses direction. Europeans have crossed the Atlantic believing they are entering and transforming another world. Now a plant from that world begins transforming theirs. From Spain and Portugal, maize finds roots outward. The exact path is not a single clean line on a map. Crops rarely behave so politely. Seeds move through ports, markets, estates, gardens, borderlands, merchant networks, and communities. Some people experiment with maize as animal feed. Others treat it as food for poorer households. In some places it remains unusual. In others it becomes familiar surprisingly quickly. The Mediterranean offers especially promising conditions. Warm summers suit the crop. Farmers notice its productivity. And poor farmers notice something else. Hunger has a way of making agricultural experimentation easier. For a wealthy household, choosing one grain over another can be a matter of preference. For a family living close to the edge of scarcity, yield has a different meaning. More food from the same patch of land may mean the difference between discomfort and disaster. Maize does not need to be fashionable. It needs to fill a stomach, so it begins moving into the countryside. Portugal becomes an important point in its wider journey. Portuguese maritime networks stretch along the coasts of Africa and into Asia. Ships connect ports separated by distances that would once have seemed almost impossible. Merchants carry useful plants as readily as they carry cloth, spices, metals, and other goods. A crop that grows well and feeds people is worth trying somewhere else. Then somewhere else again. Maize begins traveling farther than many of the sailors who first encountered it. A sailor dies, a merchant retires, a king is buried. A dynasty changes. The seed continues. This is one of the peculiar advantages plants have over people in history. A person has one lifetime. A crop can recruit every generation. One farmer plants it. His children plant it. Their neighbors try it. A trader carries seed to another valley. A ship takes it to another coast. Within a surprisingly short span of historical time, maize appears in places whose inhabitants have no direct connection with the Caribbean communities from whom Europeans first obtained it. Its name changes from language to language, its recipes change. Its place in society changes, but the plant continues. Across parts of the Mediterranean world, maize enters a landscape already crowded with ancient agriculture. Olive trees cling to slopes. Grapevines follow hillsides. Wheat bends beneath the wind. Goats search patiently for anything remotely edible. Villages sit beneath church towers or along dusty roads. Into this old world comes the newcomer. At first, it can look almost decorative. Its tall stalks are unlike the lower grain fields familiar to many Europeans. Its broad leaves rustle differently. The ears are hidden beneath husks. The plant has an exotic quality simply because people have not yet grown bored with seeing it. That boredom will come. It always does when something becomes useful enough. Soon there are places where maize is no longer a curiosity. It is supper. The change happens most strongly among people who cannot afford to be sentimental about food. Peasant families learn to grind the grain. It becomes porridge and other simple dishes. It can stretch household supplies and provide dependable calories. Landowners recognize that it can support laborers and livestock. In favorable regions, cultivation expands. The crop moves eastward as well. Through trade and contact, maize reaches territories around the Balkans and beyond. It enters the complicated agricultural worlds of the Ottoman lands. It appears in regions connected by merchants and armies, by roads and rivers, by taxation and migration. People who may never have heard of Columbus begin planting an American crop. They do not need to know its biography. A seed does not require the farmer to understand geography, only soil, water, warmth, and work. This is how maize begins to escape the story of its European discoverers. The word discoverers itself deserves caution, of course. The crop was not waiting to be discovered. Millions of people in the Americas already knew it intimately. Europeans discovered maize only in the narrow sense that it was new to Europeans. To everyone who had been cultivating it for generations, the newcomers were simply late. And they were late to something else as well: knowledge. When Europeans carried maize away, they carried the physical crop with remarkable success. But knowledge is harder to pack into a sack. In Mesoamerica, maize had never been merely seed plus soil. Its cultivation existed inside a larger system of practice. Farmers understood varieties and seasons. Cooks understood preparation. Communities possessed generations of accumulated knowledge about how maize should be transformed before it became a central part of the diet. Among those practices was the alkaline treatment we encountered beside the cooking fires of the previous part of our journey: nixtamalization. Dried maize could be cooked or soaked with an alkaline substance such as lime, then washed and prepared for grinding. To modern ears, this can sound like a small culinary detail. It is not. It changes the grain physically. The outer layer becomes easier to remove. Grinding becomes easier. Flavor and texture change, and critically, nutrients within the maize become more available to the human body. The cooks of Mesoamerica do not need to describe the chemistry. They know the method. This distinction matters because human knowledge often works long before anyone can explain scientifically why it works. A grandmother may teach a method because her grandmother taught her. A cook may know that grain behaves better after a certain treatment. A farmer may understand that one seed belongs in one kind of soil and another somewhere else. Modern observers sometimes mistake the absence of written chemistry for the absence of knowledge, but practical knowledge can be extremely precise. It simply lives in different places, in hands, in routines, in taste, in memory. In the phrase, "this is how it is done." When maize crosses the Atlantic, much of that cultural machinery does not cross with it. Europeans can see the plant, they can count its kernels. They can observe how high it grows, they can dry it, they can plant it, they can grind it, but they do not automatically understand every reason behind indigenous preparation methods. And why would they? From their point of view, maize is another grain. Europe already has grains. Grains are ground. Grains become porridge. Grains feed poor people. The logic seems simple, too simple. At first, the missing knowledge causes little reason for alarm. A family that eats maize occasionally while also eating beans, vegetables, dairy products, meat, or other grains may have no obvious problem. A varied diet can cover many nutritional gaps, but poverty has a way of destroying variety. When one crop is cheap, productive, and filling, the poor can become dependent upon it. Not because they are foolish, because they are poor. A laboring family does not choose its meals from an ideal list of nutrients. It eats what it can grow, buy, receive, or afford. If maize fills the stomach more cheaply than alternatives, maize appears more often. Then more often still, in certain regions, generations will eventually depend heavily upon maize-based foods. The plant will succeed almost too well. And here the story becomes darker in the quiet way that food history often does. There will be no invading army, no poisoned well, no villain standing over a cooking pot. There will simply be a missing step. A small piece of inherited knowledge left behind on the other side of an ocean. For a while, nobody understands what has gone wrong. People eat. Their stomachs are full enough to continue working. Yet some bodies begin to weaken. Skin changes. Illness appears. Communities search for explanations. Doctors will argue. Officials will misunderstand. The poor themselves will often be blamed for conditions created by poverty and nutritional dependence. And maize, the crop that seems to offer protection from hunger, will become entangled with a disease that terrifies entire regions. That story is still ahead of us. For now, maize continues spreading. In Spain, it rises beneath the sun. In Portugal, seed passes through maritime networks. Around the Mediterranean, farmers test it against old habits and difficult soils. In villages farther east, it acquires new names and new recipes. Livestock eat it, children eat it. Laborers carry meals made from it into fields. Women stir thick pots over household fires. Millstones grind, merchants sell, landowners calculate. Nobody needs to announce that a global transformation is underway. That is the strange thing about crops. They can conquer without armies. A kingdom announces itself with banners, soldiers, laws, taxes, and coins stamped with the ruler's face. A plant asks for almost nothing except that someone save its seed. Maize does not care whether the field belongs to a Christian, a Muslim, a nobleman, a tenant, a monastery, or a family barely surviving from one harvest to the next. It grows where conditions allow. Political borders may stop soldiers. They are less effective against dinner. And so the strange grain from across the Atlantic becomes less strange. Within a few generations, children are born into European villages where maize has always seemed to be there. Their grandparents may remember when it was unusual, their grandchildren may consider it ordinary. That is how quickly cultural memory can shorten. Foods acquire false ancestries. People begin treating yesterday's newcomer as though it belongs naturally to the landscape. Tomatoes will eventually seem inseparable from Italian cooking. Potatoes will become deeply associated with Ireland and Northern Europe. Peppers will transform cuisines thousands of miles from the Americas. And maize will settle into European valleys, Mediterranean kitchens, African fields, and eventually vast portions of the wider world. The Great Exchange is doing something more complicated than moving ingredients. It is rewriting what places taste like. But there is a cruel imbalance hidden inside that transformation. Europe has taken the plant. It has not always taken the instructions. Perhaps no one thinks of them as instructions. Perhaps the preparation techniques appear merely local, unnecessary, or strange. Perhaps Europeans assume their familiar methods for treating grain will work well enough. For many purposes, they do. Maize can still be cooked, it can still fill a bowl, it can still quiet hunger. And that is precisely why the danger remains hidden. A food can provide calories while failing to provide everything the body needs. A stomach can feel full while the body slowly becomes deficient. The contradiction is difficult to see when no one yet understands vitamins, metabolism, or nutritional deficiency in modern scientific terms. Centuries will pass before the mystery is properly untangled. Meanwhile, poor families will live inside the experiment, not knowingly, not willingly. They will simply eat what the land and their circumstances provide. And so, as evening falls over another field, far from the warm landscapes where maize was first shaped, the crop stands in unfamiliar soil. Its leaves move beneath a European wind. A farmer looks across the field and sees success. The plants are tall. The harvest promises food. There may be relief in that sight. There should be. For countless people, maize genuinely will mean more reliable calories, better use of land, and another defense against hunger. Yet history rarely offers gifts without complications. Inside the kernels lies nourishment. Inside the culture from which those kernels came lies knowledge about how to unlock more of it. The first has crossed the ocean. The second has not traveled nearly as well. And somewhere between those two facts waits the next chapter of our story. The grain that helped protect poor families from an empty stomach is about to teach Europe a much harsher lesson. Sometimes it is possible to carry a treasure across the entire Atlantic and still leave behind the most important part. Now we move away from the salt-stained ports and crowded docks, away from sailors unloading strange cargo beneath Mediterranean sunlight and into quieter places. We follow the grain inland, along rough roads and narrow valleys, past market squares and church towers, until we reach the homes of people whose names rarely survive in history books. These are not the people who decide where borders should lie. They do not command armies or commission paintings. Most own little, and some own nothing at all. Their lives are measured in rent, harvests, weather, firewood, aching joints, and the amount of food remaining before spring. For them, the arrival of maize is not a story about exploration. It is a story about supper. Across parts of northern Italy, the Balkans, and other regions of southern and southeastern Europe, maize slowly becomes familiar. At first, it is merely another crop among older crops. Wheat still carries prestige. Rye, barley, millet, chestnuts, beans, and other foods remain important according to region and circumstance. But maize possesses a quality that poor households understand immediately. It can produce a great deal of food. That simple fact matters more than any fashionable opinion about taste. Imagine a farming family living in a damp house at the edge of a village in northern Italy. The walls are rough. Smoke from the hearth does not always leave through the opening intended for it. A wooden table stands beneath a small window. Outside are fields that must provide enough food not only for the people working them, but often enough value to satisfy landlords, taxes, rents, debts, and obligations. Land is precious. Good land is more precious. And the poor rarely receive the best of anything. A crop that produces generously from limited ground therefore begins to look almost miraculous. Maize rises tall, its leaves spread broadly, its ears swell beneath their husks. When harvest comes, the kernels can be dried and stored. They can be ground into meal, they can become a thick porridge that fills bowls and stomachs alike. In northern Italy, this porridge becomes deeply associated with polenta. Today, polenta may appear on a restaurant plate beside cheese, mushrooms, braised meat, or some carefully arranged sauce. It can seem rustic in the pleasant modern sense of the word, suggesting warm kitchens and old recipes. For many poor families in earlier centuries, rustic life is rather less decorative. Polenta is not an interesting side dish. It may be the meal. A large pot hangs or sits near the fire. Water heats. Maize meal is added slowly. Someone stirs and continues stirring because thick porridge has an unfortunate habit of becoming stubborn. Steam rises into the room. The mixture grows heavy. Arms tire. There may be a little cheese if the household is fortunate. Perhaps milk, perhaps beans, perhaps vegetables, perhaps something richer on a feast day. But in the poorest homes, there is often simply more polenta. It is warm. It is filling. It is relatively cheap. And tomorrow there may be polenta again. Then the day after that, this repetition is the hidden hinge of our story. Maize itself is not a poison. It has sustained societies in the Americas for thousands of years. It is capable of forming part of a healthy and sophisticated food system. The danger in Europe does not come from some wicked kernel waiting patiently to betray anyone who eats it. The danger comes from dependence. And dependence is something poverty creates remarkably well. A wealthy person can become bored with a meal. A poor person may not have that luxury. If wheat prices rise, the wealthy complain. If wheat prices rise enough, the poor change what they eat. If meat becomes expensive, it disappears from the poor table long before it disappears from the wealthy one. If dairy is scarce, if vegetables are seasonal, if beans are limited, if wages are low and rents remain due, the question is no longer what would make a balanced meal. The question becomes, what will stop hunger tonight? Maize answers that question beautifully. That is why it becomes dangerous. In villages across regions where the crop spreads, fields that once produced other grains may increasingly carry maize. Landlords appreciate productivity. Farmers appreciate reliability. Laboring families appreciate calories. A crop from another continent becomes woven into local survival so thoroughly that, within generations, it can seem as though it has always belonged there. The same process unfolds in different forms farther east. Across parts of the Balkans, maize finds landscapes where it grows well and communities eager for dependable food. Political borders shift, empires compete, taxes change hands. Armies march along roads and disappear again. The maize remains. That is one of the quiet advantages of a useful crop. It does not care which ruler's portrait appears on a coin. A farmer may wake under one administration and die under another while planting much the same field. The stalks rise regardless. Through summer they stand green and tall. In autumn ears are gathered and carried home. Kernels dry, mills grind, pots fill, children grow up with the taste. What was once foreign becomes traditional. And this should remind us that tradition is often younger than it appears. People can become fiercely attached to foods their distant ancestors never encountered. A crop arrives, becomes useful, survives a few generations, and suddenly everyone is certain grandmother's grandmother must have cooked it exactly this way since the beginning of time. Human memory is generous with recipes. It is less reliable with agricultural history. By the 18th and 19th centuries, maize has become deeply important to poor rural diets in several European regions. In northern Italy especially, dependence on maize porridge among impoverished peasants can become extreme. From a distance, the arrangement appears efficient. A small plot produces abundant calories. Those calories support workers. Workers cultivate land. Land produces another crop. The system repeats. Landowners can look across productive fields and see success. Officials can count harvests and see success. A traveler passing through after harvest might see piles of maize and assume that hunger has been defeated. But abundance and nourishment are not always the same thing. Inside some cottages, a strange illness begins to become familiar. It does not arrive dramatically. There is no mourning when an entire village wakes with the same unmistakable sickness. Instead, one person begins to feel unwell, then another. The earliest signs can be easy to dismiss. A laborer's body is already tired from labor. Poor people are accustomed to discomfort. Skin is exposed to weather. Stomachs are not always reliable. Weakness can be blamed on age, work, bad air, bad water, bad luck, or any of the countless explanations available before modern medicine understands nutritional deficiency. Then the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Skin exposed to sunlight can become inflamed and painfully damaged. Digestive problems appear. Weakness deepens. For some sufferers, confusion and changes in behavior follow. The disease will come to be known as pellagra. Its name becomes associated especially strongly with impoverished populations whose diets rely heavily on untreated maize and contain too little variety to compensate. But knowing the name does not mean knowing the cause. For generations, people struggle to understand what they are seeing. This is where the story becomes painfully human. Imagine a woman in a rural household noticing changes in her husband's hands after weeks of work beneath the sun. The skin is reddened and sore. Perhaps they assume the sunlight has burned him. Perhaps they blame fieldwork. He continues working because the household cannot afford for him not to. At supper there is polenta. The next morning there is more work. His strength does not return. Elsewhere, another family watches a relative become increasingly ill. The symptoms seem to affect different parts of the body. which makes the illness even more confusing. Skin, digestion, strength, mind. These do not immediately look like pieces of the same puzzle, and the food itself appears innocent. Everyone eats it. The porridge is familiar. It has kept people alive. How could the thing preventing starvation be connected with sickness? That question will confuse doctors and officials for a very long time. Some suspect infection. Others blame spoiled maize. Others blame poverty without understanding precisely how poverty acts through diet. Some theories focus on toxins or contamination. And, as so often happens when society does not understand a disease affecting the poor, moral judgment slips into the discussion. The sufferers are blamed, their homes are blamed, their habits are blamed. Their supposed ignorance is blamed. It is easier to accuse people of living badly than to ask why they have so few choices about how they live. Meanwhile, the pot remains on the fire. Polenta thickens. A wooden spoon moves slowly through it. The tragedy is that the missing answer already exists. It exists far across the Atlantic, in traditions older than European knowledge of maize itself. The peoples who first domesticated maize had not merely changed the plant. Over many generations, they had developed methods for preparing it, including the alkaline treatment now called nixtamalization. When dried maize is treated with lime or another suitable alkaline substance, something important happens. The change is partly visible. The grain becomes easier to process, its outer covering loosens. Texture changes, grinding becomes easier. But another change cannot be seen. Maize contains niacin, a nutrient the human body needs. Yet much of it is not readily available to the body when untreated maize forms the overwhelming basis of a diet. Alkaline processing helps make that nutrient available. It also changes other nutritional properties of the food. Mesoamerican cooks did not need the modern word niacin to benefit from the process. They did not need to describe vitamins. They did not need a microscope. They needed accumulated knowledge. That knowledge lived in routine. A child could watch an adult prepare maize and learn the method without ever receiving a lecture on chemistry. The lesson might be no more complicated than this is how we prepare it. And sometimes those few words contain centuries of experiment. This is one of history's most important forms of knowledge, and one of the easiest to overlook. Written societies often admire written explanations. Modern societies admire laboratories, measurements, formulas, and technical language. All of those things are powerful, but human beings knew useful things long before they could explain them in modern scientific terms. People fermented food before understanding microbes. They made bread rise before understanding yeast cells. They preserved meat before understanding bacteria. They selected seeds before understanding genes. And they processed maize in ways that protected nutrition before anyone could name the vitamin involved. Knowledge does not become knowledge only when someone wearing spectacles writes it in a book. Sometimes knowledge is a grandmother standing beside a pot. Europe had received the seed, it had not fully received the grandmother, and the difference was enormous. When maize crossed the Atlantic, Europeans saw the obvious part of the technology, the plant. They could touch it, they could weigh it, they could count the harvest, they could compare how much grain came from a field. What they did not carry with equal success was the invisible network of practices surrounding it. This is the hidden trap. Not that maize is secretly harmful, not that indigenous people possess some mystical protection from it. The problem is far more ordinary. A crop is taken out of one food system and placed into another. One part travels, another part does not. For people who eat maize alongside a varied diet, the missing processing method may never produce disaster. Other foods can provide the nutrients they need. But among desperately poor communities where maize becomes the dominant source of calories, there is little room for nutritional error. The same productivity that makes maize attractive makes dependence easier. The better it succeeds in the field, the more completely it can occupy the bowl. And the more completely it occupies the bowl, the more dangerous the missing knowledge becomes. Pellagra spreads among vulnerable populations. Its effects are slow enough to become part of the landscape of poverty. A person does not eat one bowl of untreated maize and collapse. That would at least make the mystery easier. Instead, deficiency accumulates, days become weeks. Weeks become months. The body spends what it has, then it begins to run short. Skin exposed to sunlight develops the characteristic lesions. Diarrhea may weaken the sufferer further. Neurological and mental symptoms can emerge as the deficiency becomes severe. Doctors later summarize pellagra through a grim collection of symptoms, but inside a household there is nothing tidy about it. There is only someone changing, someone growing weaker, someone who once worked all day now struggling to continue, someone whose behavior may no longer seem like their own. And because the poorest people are affected most heavily, the disease acquires the smell of social judgment. It becomes associated with dirty cottages, exhausted laborers, isolated villages, and people who have little political voice. Yet, step back from the suffering, and the structure becomes clearer. The peasant family has not failed because it chose the wrong fashionable diet. The family is trapped inside an economic system that makes variety difficult. Land may be controlled by someone else. Wages may be poor. Protein-rich foods may be scarce or expensive. The household eats what is available. Maize is available. So maize returns to the table again and again. The crop that seemed to offer freedom from hunger has created a different vulnerability. This is not because the first farmers of Mesoamerica made a flawed crop. Quite the opposite. They created an extraordinary crop and developed an extraordinary body of knowledge around it. The failure occurs when later societies separate those two achievements. Europe adopts the biological invention. It neglects part of the cultural invention. And for centuries, it does not even realize that anything important is missing. There is something haunting about that. A sack of maize can survive an ocean crossing. A cooking tradition cannot travel unless people carry it. Seeds are compact. Knowledge is fragile. It depends upon language, observation, respect, memory, and the willingness to believe that the people who have used something for generations may know things that newcomers do not. Colonial encounters are rarely famous for that kind of humility. Europeans often approached indigenous societies believing that European methods, European religion, European institutions, and European knowledge stood above what they encountered. Useful plants could be collected, land could be claimed, resources could be extracted. But local knowledge was easier to dismiss. The irony is almost too perfect. The conquerors recognized the value of the crop. They did not fully recognize the value of the people who knew how to use it. And the consequences appeared not in royal palaces, but on the skin and in the bodies of poor families generations later. Eventually, science begins to understand the disease more clearly. Researchers connect pellagra to diet. Nutritional science advances. The role of niacin becomes understood. And the old mystery slowly loses its mystery. But by then, countless people have suffered. The answer had crossed no ocean because for a very long time, Europeans did not know there was a question. So tonight, before we leave these cottages and fields, imagine the scene once more. Outside, maize stands beneath the late summer sun. It is a magnificent crop, tall, productive, generous. A farmer walks between the rows and sees security. Inside the house, a pot warms over the fire. A family gathers around it. They are not foolish. They are not careless. They are doing what human beings have always done when resources are limited. They are surviving with what they have. The tragedy lies not in the grain before them, but in what history failed to carry alongside it. Across the ocean, generations of cooks had known how to transform maize through methods inherited from those who came before. Their knowledge had been tested, not in a laboratory, but through centuries of meals. Europe took the seed and left much of that experience behind, and perhaps this is where corn's story becomes larger than corn. Civilizations are often eager to collect useful things from one another. A crop, a tool, a medicine, a technique, but useful things rarely exist alone. They sit inside webs of knowledge, custom, environment, and experience. Remove the object from that web. And sometimes it still works beautifully. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes the missing piece is so small that no one notices until generations have paid the price. The maize in the European field looks almost identical whether the farmer understands nixtamalization or not. The harvest can be equally golden, the bowl can feel equally full. That is what makes the lesson so quiet. The mistake cannot be seen simply by looking at the crop. And while families across Europe continue stirring maize porridge over their fires, the plant itself is preparing for yet another transformation. Soon it will move beyond the human bowl in a much larger way. Farmers will discover that what feeds people can also feed animals. Animals can become meat. Meat can feed cities. Surplus can become trade. Fields can support markets far beyond the village where the grain was grown. The little grass shaped by ancient hands is becoming part of an economic machine no Mesoamerican farmer could have imagined. So let us leave the heavy pot beside the cottage fire, still steaming in the evening gloom outside. Pigs shuffle impatiently behind a wooden fence. They too are waiting for corn. And their appetite will carry our strange golden grain into another chapter of the world. Now we move from the steaming bowl beside the cottage fire to the darker building just beyond the door, the barn. It is not a romantic place, at least not if you are actually standing inside it. The floor is damp. Mud has been carried in on boots and hooves. Straw lies in uneven heaps, clean and golden in some corners, dark and unpleasant in others. Wooden beams disappear into shadow above. A hen scratches beneath a feeding trough with the determined concentration of a creature convinced that one final grain must be hiding somewhere. Somewhere farther back, a pig grunts in the darkness. Then another answers. The smell is powerful enough to make any poetic description of rural life reconsider its ambitions. But this barn is important, for corn is about to perform another trick. Until now, much of our story has followed maize into the human stomach. It has become bread, porridge, polenta, and the daily food of families who need dependable calories from limited land. Yet farmers quickly understand that humans are not the only creatures willing to eat grain. Animals are less particular critics. A pig does not care whether maize came from across the Atlantic. A chicken has no opinion about the Columbian exchange, and so part of the harvest begins to disappear into wooden troughs. At first, this may seem like a waste. Why feed useful grain to an animal when a human being could eat it directly? The answer becomes clearer when we look at what the animal produces. A pig can turn feed into meat and fat. A hen turns part of what she eats into eggs and eventually meat. Cattle and other livestock can consume mixtures of pasture, fodder, crop residues, and grain according to local farming systems, converting plants into milk, meat, hides, manure, and labor. Suddenly, the field is doing more than filling a bowl. It is feeding an entire farm. And a farm is not merely a collection of fields. It is a complicated little machine made from soil, animals, people, weather, tools, waste, hunger, and hope. Nothing is truly separate. The grain feeds the pig produces manure, the manure returns to the land produces another crop. A horse or ox pulls the cart carries grain, the grain feeds people and animals. The people tend the fields, round and round it goes. Not perfectly, not efficiently by modern standards, but persistently. For families living close to scarcity, livestock can serve almost like walking storage. A sack of grain can be eaten. A pig can be fed gradually and slaughtered when the household needs a large supply of meat and fat. Meat can be salted, smoked, dried, or otherwise preserved. Fat can be rendered and used in cooking. Almost every useful part of the animal can find a purpose. This makes the pig especially valuable. Pigs are wonderfully unromantic creatures. They are intelligent, adaptable, and remarkably enthusiastic about eating. They consume kitchen scraps, agricultural leftovers, fallen fruit, roots, grains, and many other things available around farms. In wooded regions, they can forage. In more settled agricultural systems, they can be fattened deliberately. And maize is very good at helping a pig become a larger pig. That fact sounds almost too ordinary to belong in a history of world-changing crops, yet ordinary facts often have enormous consequences. Imagine autumn approaching somewhere in southern or central Europe. The air is cooler now. The harvest has been brought in. Ears of maize hang beneath shelter or lie stored where they can continue drying. Their husks rustle when someone passes. Kernels have hardened. Some will be kept for human food, some will be saved for planting, and some will be fed to animals. Morning begins before sunrise. A farmer crosses the yard carrying a bucket. His boots sink slightly into mud left by yesterday's rain. The pigs hear him before they see him. The barn suddenly becomes very interested. There is shuffling, snorting. A wooden gate complains against its hinge. The feed hits the trough. For a moment, the empire of human civilization can wait. The pigs are having breakfast. This scene repeats across countless farms. No chronicler records it. No painter is summoned. Yet the repetition matters because each animal being fattened represents stored energy from the field being transformed into another kind of food. The field produces maize, the maize produces meat. The meat can be eaten by the household, sold in a market, supplied to towns, or preserved for later use. One harvest now has several possible lives. Corn can remain corn, or corn can become pork, it can become eggs. It can help support dairy animals within mixed feeding systems. It can help keep working animals in condition when grain feeding is useful and affordable. And every transformation connects the farm to a wider economy. This is where our quiet barn door begins to open onto something much larger. A peasant family may think in terms of winter. A merchant thinks in terms of markets. A government thinks in terms of populations. An army thinks in terms of supplies. All of them, whether they realize it or not, depend on the same basic problem. How do you keep living bodies fed? For most of human history, this question is more important than almost any grand political theory. A ruler may claim a throne through blood, marriage, conquest, or divine favor. But none of these can make a hungry horse move. A general may possess courage, maps, and magnificent boots. None of these can feed soldiers. A city may have walls thick enough to discourage an enemy. Walls do not grow bread. Every complicated society rests on a layer of agriculture so ordinary that people above it often forget to look down. Corn settles into that layer. In some regions, it becomes a dependable source of animal feed precisely because it can produce so much energy from cultivated land. Farmers do not need to understand the modern science of calories to notice results. Feed animals well and they gain weight. Feed them poorly and they do not. The lesson is visible. A pig becomes rounder, a hen lays. An animal survives the cold months in better condition. Experience teaches what theory has not yet explained. There is also another advantage: maize stores. Once properly dried and protected from moisture and pests, grain can remain useful long after the field itself has turned brown. Storage is one of civilization's quiet superpowers. A fresh harvest is abundance. A stored harvest is time. The difference is enormous. Food stored after autumn can feed animals when winter strips the landscape of easy forage. It can help a household survive months when nothing useful grows nearby. It can be sold later. It can be moved. Of course, storage brings its own enemies: rats, mice, insects, mold, damp, thieves. And occasionally relatives who are remarkably generous with grain they did not grow. So barns, granaries, cribs, lofts, bins, and other storage spaces become part of the agricultural landscape. Picture a corn store before winter. Dry ears are stacked or hung where air can move around them. Dust floats through shafts of pale light. Husks whisper against one another. Outside, cold weather is approaching. Inside is summer captured in seed. That stored energy can be released slowly. A little today, a little tomorrow. A little more when animals need fattening before slaughter. And so maize begins extending the productive season of the farm. The field may be asleep beneath frost, but the harvest continues working. In the barn, it becomes flesh. In the kitchen, it becomes porridge. In the market, it becomes money. And farther away, in towns that are growing larger, people increasingly depend upon farmers they will never meet. This is where the story changes scale. Let us step out of the barn and follow the road. It is a poor road. Most roads are. Mud collects in deep ruts. Wheels sink, horses strain. In dry weather, dust rises and settles on clothes, hair, sacks, and every exposed surface. A journey that looks short on a map may consume an exhausting day. Yet carts keep moving. They carry grain. They carry animals. They carry salted meat. They carry eggs, cheese, flour, hides, firewood, tools, and the thousand ordinary things required by people who no longer grow everything they consume. At the end of some of these roads lies a town, beyond other roads, a city. And cities are hungry creatures. A village can live close to its fields, a large city cannot. The more people gather behind walls and along crowded streets, the more food must arrive from somewhere else. Every morning mouths open. Every evening they expect to have been fed. There is no day when a city politely decides not to consume anything because the roads are muddy. Bakers need grain, butchers need animals, brewers need ingredients, markets need produce. Households need fuel and food, stables need fodder. The animals hauling supplies into the city need to eat while performing the work of bringing supplies into the city, which is one of those circular inconveniences history rarely places on statues. As European populations grow in many regions and commercial networks deepen, agricultural productivity matters more and more. Maize contributes to that productivity. It does not act alone. No serious history of European growth can place everything at the feet of one crop. Potatoes become enormously important in many regions. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, legumes, pasture, livestock, fisheries, trade, improved farming practices, changing land use, and countless local systems all play their parts. But maize adds another powerful source of food and feed. And because it can support livestock, its influence reaches beyond the people who eat maize directly. Consider a town resident buying pork. She may never see a maize field. She may not eat maize porridge. She may not even think much about maize. Yet the pig may have been fattened partly on maize. The field has reached her table disguised as meat. This is one of the great transformations in the history of corn. It begins to disappear inside other foods. Later, this will happen on an astonishing industrial scale. For now, the process remains closer to the farm. Corn enters a pig. The pig enters a market. The market feeds a town. The town supports craftsmen, officials, merchants, priests, soldiers, servants, builders, and people engaged in work that does not involve growing their own dinner. Agricultural surplus makes specialization possible. The idea is simple. If nearly everyone must spend nearly all their time producing food, there is less labor available for everything else. When farmers can produce enough to support additional people, society gains room. Someone can become a full-time blacksmith. Someone can weave cloth, someone can build ships, someone can keep accounts, someone can spend an astonishing amount of time arguing about theology. Someone can become a professional soldier. The distance between a field and an empire is shorter than it looks. Empires are usually described from the top. We see crowns, palaces, maps, treaties, battles. A ruler points at a territory and announces that it now belongs to him, which must have been very satisfying for the ruler and somewhat less satisfying for the people already living there. But look beneath the map. There are farms, always farms. An army on campaign is a moving town with weapons. It eats constantly. Soldiers require bread, grain, meat, drink, salt, and whatever else can be obtained. Horses consume enormous amounts of fodder. Pack animals need feed. Carts require animals to pull them, and those animals also need food. A commander can plan the most brilliant march in history and still lose to an empty supply wagon. This is why logistics repeatedly humiliates ambition. The farther an army travels, the harder it becomes to feed. Supplies must come from depots, markets, requisitions, local farms, purchased provisions, or whatever combination circumstances allow. And behind every sack of grain stands labor. Someone planted it, someone weeded around it, someone harvested it, someone dried it, someone stored it, someone loaded it onto a cart, someone repaired the cart. Someone fed the animal pulling the cart. Someone cursed the road when the wheel became trapped in mud. The heroic painting generally leaves these people out. The empire cannot. As maize becomes established in European agriculture, it enters these larger systems indirectly and directly. It supports rural populations, it feeds livestock, it creates marketable surplus, it becomes one more crop that can be taxed, traded, stored, and moved. The grain is no longer merely a foreign curiosity, it is infrastructure. Not infrastructure made from stone, infrastructure made from sunlight. A field captures a season of warmth and turns it into kernels. Those kernels can wait. That waiting is what gives grain political power. Fresh vegetables are wonderful, but armies cannot always rely on delicate vegetables surviving long journeys. Livestock can walk, though moving animals creates its own problems. Grain, when properly stored, is compact enough to transport and durable enough to matter. A sack can travel. A storehouse can accumulate thousands of sacks. A government that controls enough food can support people who produce no food themselves. Officials, workers, sailors, soldiers, urban populations. Power begins to look suspiciously like a full granary. There is an old temptation to imagine empires as creatures driven entirely by ambition. A king wants more land, a merchant wants more profit. A general wants glory, a government wants taxes, all true often enough. But ambition must eat breakfast. That is the part we forget. A palace requires kitchens, a navy requires biscuits and preserved provisions, a cavalry unit requires fodder. A city requires daily deliveries. A mine full of workers requires food brought from elsewhere. A growing manufacturing center depends upon countryside it may never see. The greater the concentration of people, the greater the invisible agricultural landscape supporting them. Maize becomes one strand in that landscape, and as trade expands, the strand lengthens. A farmer may produce grain not for his own household but for sale. A merchant purchases it, a miller processes it, an animal feeder uses it. A butcher sells the resulting meat. A city household buys that meat. At every stage, value changes hands. The crop has become part of commerce. This alters rural life too. Producing for markets can create opportunity, but it also creates dependence on prices. If maize sells well, farmers plant more. If livestock prices rise, feeding grain to animals may become more attractive. If transport improves, distant markets become reachable. Roads, rivers, canals, and ports pull farms into networks larger than the village. The countryside becomes connected to appetites elsewhere. A pig fattened in one district may end up feeding someone who has never heard of that district. A sack of maize may travel farther than the farmer who grew it ever will. And the farther food can move, the larger human settlements can become. This does not happen smoothly. Harvests fail, wars interrupt trade, roads become unsafe. Ships sink. Officials miscalculate. Merchants hoard. Prices rise. Poor families suffer first. Food systems are always impressive until something breaks. Then everyone remembers how fragile they are. A city accustomed to regular deliveries can become anxious remarkably quickly when carts stop arriving. A besieged city learns the value of grain with terrible clarity. An army cut off from supplies begins consuming the countryside around it. A bad harvest turns political complaints into unrest. Bread prices have helped make and unmake governments. Hunger has no respect for ceremony. Corn, therefore, enters a world where food is not merely nourishment. It is stability, it is taxation. It is trade, it is military capacity, it is social peace, and still back on the farm, none of this necessarily feels grand. The farmer wakes in darkness. Perhaps a rooster has begun making noise with the confidence of a creature that contributes very little to astronomy. The hearth is stirred back to life. Animals need feeding. Water must be carried. Tools must be checked. In planting season, there is planting. In harvest season, there is harvesting. In winter, there are repairs, feeding, threshing, shelling, storage, and endless small tasks. The work repeats because hunger repeats. This is the foundation beneath the grand machinery. Not the emperor, not the general. The person carrying the bucket before sunrise. History often remembers the people who consumed the surplus more clearly than the people who created it. We know the names of rulers whose horses ate grain grown by nameless farmers. We know generals whose armies marched because nameless families filled wagons. We know merchants who became wealthy moving goods produced by hands that left no written record. The cornfield does not complain about this arrangement. It simply grows. By late summer, tall stalks rustle in the wind. Ears fill. Leaves begin to dry. Harvest comes. Some kernels enter human bowls, others fall into troughs. A pig lowers its head and eats. Months later, preserved pork may travel toward a city. A laborer eats it before beginning work. A soldier eats it before marching. A sailor eats it before crossing water. The energy moves from sunlight to plant, from plant to animal, from animal to human, and from human muscle into the work of civilization. Seen this way, history begins to look less like a collection of famous names and more like a chain of meals. And maize is becoming very good at entering that chain. Its journey is still far from finished. Across the Atlantic, another society is expanding over enormous distances. Settlers are moving inland through North America, often onto lands taken from indigenous peoples through war, coercion, treaties, displacement, and broken promises. Farms appear along rough frontiers, where roads are poor and markets can be painfully distant. There, maize will present farmers with a familiar problem. They can grow plenty of it, but grain is heavy. A wagon can carry only so much. A road can turn to mud. A distant market may be days away, so farmers will begin asking a practical question. If corn is difficult to transport in its bulky form, could it be turned into something smaller, more valuable, and considerably more interesting to drink? The answer will place maize inside barrels. The barrels will attract merchants. The merchants will attract tax collectors. And the tax collectors will discover, as tax collectors often do, that a perfectly reasonable government policy can become much less reasonable when explained to an angry farmer holding a jug of whiskey. For now, however, the barn is quiet again. The animals have been fed. Winter presses against the walls in the darkness. Ears of maize hang beneath the rafters, holding the remains of summer inside their dry kernels. They look humble. But those kernels are already feeding more than a family. They are feeding animals, markets, towns, armies, and the expanding machinery of states. Empires may dream in gold, but they survive on grain. Let us leave the granaries, barns, and hungry animals behind and cross the Atlantic once more, following corn into a younger and more restless world. The landscape has changed. We are now in North America after the colonial age, in the uneasy years when the United States is new enough that no one can be entirely certain what kind of country it will become. Along the Atlantic coast stand established towns, busy ports, workshops, warehouses, and government offices, but travel west, beyond the older settlements and across the Appalachian Mountains, and the world becomes rougher. Here, political ideas that sound elegant in a government chamber must survive mud. There are scattered farms, forested hills, narrow valleys, cabins built from timber, and roads that occasionally seem to have been designed by someone who disliked wheels. A farmer may live many difficult miles from the nearest useful market. He clears land, plants crops, repairs fences, cares for animals, raises children, cuts firewood, and spends much of his life negotiating with weather. Among the crops growing in these frontier regions is an old American companion, corn. It thrives in places where settlers need it to thrive. It feeds families, it feeds pigs, it can be stored, it can be ground. It can be traded. And it presents one irritating problem. Corn is heavy. This may sound obvious, but weight becomes political when roads are terrible. Imagine the harvest gathered into sacks. There is value sitting inside them, but that value must somehow reach a buyer. A distant town may offer a good price, yet getting there means loading a wagon and persuading animals to drag the grain across roads that turn to deep mud after rain. Wheels sink, axles break, horses tire, bridges are unreliable. Streams rise. A journey that seems simple on a map becomes an argument between human determination and wet soil. The farmer begins doing arithmetic without needing to write anything down. How much grain can the wagon carry? How much time will the journey take? How much food will the animals consume? What will repairs cost? How much grain will be lost along the way? And after all that trouble, how much money will remain? Sometimes the answer is unpleasant. The farmer has produced something valuable, yet distance has trapped much of that value on the farm. Fortunately, human beings have a long history of discovering ways to make grain more portable. The solution is waiting near a copper still. Corn can be fermented, then it can be distilled, and when corn becomes whiskey, something interesting happens. A bulky agricultural product becomes a smaller, more concentrated, more valuable product that is easier to transport. The farmer has not merely made a drink, he has compressed his harvest. That is an important way to understand frontier whiskey. It is easy to imagine distilling only through the modern image of drinking, taverns, and recreation. But for farmers living far from large markets, whiskey can function as a practical economic tool. Grain that is difficult to move becomes liquid value. A few containers of whiskey can represent a much larger quantity of corn. The road is still muddy, the wagon still complains, but the load makes more economic sense. And so, in cabins and farm buildings across parts of the western frontier, stills become part of rural life. The process begins with grain and water. Corn is prepared and fermented. Yeast performs its invisible work. Sugars become alcohol. The fermented mixture is heated. Vapors rise and are cooled back into liquid. There is patience involved. There is experience. There is also fire beneath equipment containing alcohol, which means the entire arrangement rewards people who pay attention. The resulting whiskey is durable, portable, and desirable. It can be sold, it can be exchanged, it can be stored, and in places where cash is scarce, that last part of the story becomes particularly important. The early American frontier is not a world where every transaction involves a convenient pocket full of coins. Money can be limited, credit matters, barter matters, people exchange labor and goods. A farmer may need nails, salt, cloth, tools, or some other item he cannot easily make at home. The local merchant needs something of value in return. Whiskey works remarkably well, it is recognizable, it is useful, people want it. It does not spoil quickly under ordinary conditions. And unlike a wagon piled with loose corn, a barrel of whiskey contains substantial value in a manageable space. Corn has become something close to currency, not official currency, of course. No government printer stamps a portrait onto a jug. But economic life does not always wait for official permission. If two people agree that something has value, trade can happen. A farmer brings whiskey to a merchant. The merchant provides goods. A debt is settled. Another container travels farther east. The liquid moves through communities, taverns, trading networks, and markets. The cornfield is now participating in commerce without looking like a cornfield at all. This is another step in the crop's long transformation. In Mesoamerica, maize became civilization through food and ritual. In Europe, it entered peasant bowls and animal troughs. On the American frontier, it begins to behave like money. And the farmer understands its value very clearly. He remembers clearing the land. He remembers planting. He remembers weeds. He remembers drought. He remembers rain. He remembers harvesting. He remembers hauling the ears home. He remembers every hour of work contained inside the final liquid. The government, unfortunately, also begins to notice that the liquid has value. Governments have a remarkable instinct for such things. The new United States has survived a revolution against Britain, but winning independence has not made its financial problems disappear. War has left debts. The national government needs revenue. It needs to establish credit. It needs to prove that the new federal system can actually function rather than simply produce impressive speeches. Alexander Hamilton, serving as Secretary of the Treasury, faces the unromantic problem beneath the grand experiment of Republican government. The bills must be paid. A nation may declare liberty in beautiful language. Creditors prefer money. Hamilton supports a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. From the perspective of government finance, the idea has logic. Distilled liquor is widely produced and consumed. Taxing it can generate revenue. The federal government needs reliable income. From the perspective of a farmer in western Pennsylvania, the same policy can look rather different. He sees the still. He sees the corn. He sees the mud between his farm and distant markets. And now he sees a tax collector approaching. The afternoon is about to become complicated. The whiskey excise takes effect in the early 1790s. Almost immediately, opposition grows in western regions, especially in Pennsylvania. To understand the anger, it helps to forget for a moment the word whiskey and think instead about transportation. For large eastern distillers operating closer to markets, whiskey is a commercial product produced at scale. A tax may be inconvenient, but the business exists within a world of better access to cash and trade. For many Western farmers, distilling is woven directly into agricultural survival. They do not see whiskey merely as a luxury. It is how they move corn. It is how they preserve value. It is how some of them obtain cash or goods. Tax the whiskey, and from their perspective you are reaching backward through the still and taxing the cornfield itself. There is also an older memory hanging over the argument. These people have recently lived through a revolution born partly from disputes over taxation and political authority. The language of resistance is still warm. Many remember what Americans had said about distant officials imposing taxes. Now, the distant officials are American. This creates an awkward philosophical situation. It is one thing to oppose a tax collector sent by a king across the ocean. It is another to oppose a tax collector sent by a government created by your own revolution. The farmer, however, may notice that the tax collector looks irritatingly similar from either direction. Resistance begins in familiar ways. Meetings are held. Petitions circulate. Communities complain. Some distillers refuse to register or pay. Tax collectors and officials face intimidation. The symbolism of the revolution is borrowed freely. Protesters speak in the language of liberty and resistance to oppression. But the conflict does not remain entirely polite. Revenue officers can be threatened. People suspected of cooperating with federal authorities may be harassed. There are attacks on property. In some cases, violence enters the dispute. A tax law has collided with a region where government authority is weak, distances are large, and local communities are accustomed to solving problems without much assistance from officials far away. The question becomes larger than the price of whiskey. Can the federal government enforce its own laws? This is a serious question because the United States is still an experiment. The Constitution is new. Federal institutions are new. The memory of the earlier Articles of Confederation and its weak central government remains close. Everyone has theories about Republican government. Now someone has to make it work. For President George Washington, the challenge is uncomfortable. Washington is not merely an administrator sitting behind a desk. He is the man whose public image is tied more closely than anyone else's to the revolution itself. And now citizens are resisting a tax imposed by the government he leads. The symbolism is difficult to miss. The revolutionaries have become the authorities. The authorities have acquired tax collectors. History has a sense of humor, though rarely a gentle one. Tensions increase through the early 1790s. In western Pennsylvania, opposition becomes especially intense. Federal officials attempting to enforce the excise face hostility. Some homes and property associated with enforcement are attacked. Groups gather, rumors spread. People wonder whether the conflict will become something larger. The countryside begins to feel less like a collection of isolated complaints and more like a challenge to federal power. Imagine one of these communities in the evening. Men gather inside a tavern or farmhouse. Candles burn low. Boots leave mud near the door. A jug sits on the table. Voices rise and fall. Someone insists the tax is unjust. Someone else warns that resistance has gone too far. Another man remembers the revolution. Another worries about what soldiers might do if they come. Outside, horses stand in the cold. Inside, the argument continues. The whiskey on the table began as corn. The corn began as seed. The seed went into frontier soil. And somehow, through the strange machinery of history, it has become a question about the meaning of federal sovereignty. That is quite a journey for a grain. The crisis reaches its height in the middle of the decade. Washington's administration decides that resistance cannot simply be ignored. Negotiation and attempts at conciliation continue, but the government also prepares force. A militia army numbering in the thousands is called out from several states. For a young republic suspicious of standing armies and proud of revolutionary liberty, the sight is striking. The federal government is preparing to march against resistance among its own citizens. Washington himself travels with the force for part of its movement westward, an extraordinary moment for a sitting president. The message is deliberate. The laws of the new federal government are not optional. For the farmers and protesters, the sight of organized militia approaching changes the calculation. Angry meetings are one thing. Facing a large armed force is another. The rebellion largely dissolves before a major battle can occur. Leaders flee. Participants scatter. Arrests follow. The dramatic military confrontation some feared never truly arrives. This makes the Whiskey Rebellion unusual in memory. It sounds as though it ought to contain a grand battle. Instead, much of its importance lies in what does not happen. The United States does not collapse into regional revolt. The federal government demonstrates that it can mobilize force to enforce its laws. At the same time, the episode exposes a tension that will never completely disappear from American political life. How much power should the central government possess? Who should pay for government? When does taxation become unfair? What obligations does a citizen have to laws he believes are unjust? And how should a republic respond when political resistance becomes intimidation or violence? These are enormous questions. They arrive riding on barrels of whiskey. The tax itself is eventually repealed years later under a different administration. But the constitutional lesson has already been delivered. The new federal government has asserted its authority. It has shown that the country created after the revolution will not operate simply as a loose collection of regions obeying national law only when convenient, and corn, strangely enough, has helped force the issue. Not because corn has political opinions. Corn remains admirably neutral. It grows for Federalists and their opponents alike. It will feed anyone who plants it properly. But the economic uses of corn place it at the center of a conflict between frontier life and national finance. This is why agricultural history so often becomes political history. Governments cannot remain separate from food because food creates wealth. Wealth creates taxable activity. Taxation creates arguments. Arguments create meetings. Meetings occasionally create mobs, and mobs have a tendency to attract soldiers. The chain can begin in a field. For the Western farmer, however, the matter remains simpler. He grows corn because the land can grow corn. He distills some of it because whiskey travels better than grain. He trades the whiskey because he needs goods and money. Then someone far away decides the whiskey should be taxed. From the farmer's perspective, the government has inserted itself into a process that begins with his own labor. He may not care about Hamilton's theories of national credit. He cares that a portion of his harvest now belongs indirectly to someone else. The government sees public finance, the farmer sees his field. Both are looking at the same barrel. This conflict between distant systems and local experience is not unique to the early United States. It appears throughout history. An official sees a taxable unit. A farmer sees months of work. A merchant sees a commodity. A family sees winter food. A general sees supplies. A laborer sees dinner. Corn can be all of these things at once. That is what makes its history so useful for understanding larger systems. The grain has no fixed meaning. Its meaning depends on who is holding it. By the end of the Whiskey Rebellion, the frontier has not stopped distilling, nor has maize stopped moving westward. Quite the opposite. As the United States expands, corn expands with it. Settlers carry seed into new territories. Much of that expansion occurs through the dispossession of indigenous peoples whose ancestors had cultivated maize long before the United States existed. There is a bitter circle in this. A crop developed through indigenous knowledge becomes one of the crops carried by settlers occupying indigenous land. The plant crosses no moral boundary because plants cannot choose their owners. Human beings make those choices. As farms spread through the interior, maize finds extraordinarily favorable conditions. Rich soils, warm summers, large areas suitable for cultivation, rivers capable of carrying goods toward distant markets. The scale begins to change. The small frontier patch will eventually become something much larger. Fields stretch farther, transportation improves, canals connect regions, riverboats carry cargo, railroads arrive, markets expand. The farmer who once needed to turn corn into whiskey because grain was too difficult to move will eventually inhabit a country building an enormous transportation system designed partly to move agricultural abundance. Corn no longer needs to hide inside a barrel to travel, it can move by the ton, and that changes almost everything. Before we follow it there, however, remain for a moment in the older frontier evening. The argument has ended. The neighbors have gone home. The hearth burns low. A wooden jug sits on a rough table. Outside, the road is black with mud. Somewhere beyond the mountains, officials write letters, calculate revenue, and debate the authority of the federal government. Here, in the cabin, the matter looks smaller. A farmer lifts the jug. Inside is the value of his cornfield transformed into something he can carry. It is food turned into trade, labor turned into liquid, distance made manageable, and now it has become politics. That may be the quiet lesson of the Whiskey Rebellion. History does not always begin in palaces or battlefields. Sometimes a constitutional question begins with a bad road. Sometimes national power enters through the door of a small farmhouse. And sometimes a young republic discovers what authority really means, because someone, somewhere, has decided to put a tax on what a farmer keeps inside a wooden jug. Soon the jug will matter less. The road will improve. The canal will widen. The railway will cut across the landscape with iron wheels and smoke. Corn will leave the isolated frontier and enter a new age of machinery, science, and astonishing scale. The grain that once struggled through mud in the back of a wagon is about to cover the American interior. And when it does, the field itself will begin to look like a machine. Now we leave the muddy frontier road behind and follow the cornfield into a century of iron, steam, smoke, and distance. The wooden jug is still there for a while. Farmers still distill whiskey. Pigs still grunt beside barns. Families still shell corn by hand on cold evenings, but something larger is beginning to gather across the American interior. The land itself is being pulled into a new system, one that will connect isolated farms to towns, towns to railways, railways to cities, and cities to markets so distant that the farmer may never see the person who finally consumes what he grows. During the 19th century, the regions that will become known as the Corn Belt begin taking on their familiar agricultural importance. The name sounds simple enough, a belt of corn, but the landscape beneath that name is enormous. It stretches across much of the Midwest, through places such as Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and neighboring states, where rich soils and favorable summers make maize especially productive. Much of this soil has been built over ages beneath grasslands, whose roots reach deep into the earth. To a farmer looking across newly opened ground, the dark soil can seem almost impossibly generous, but this land is not empty. Long before American surveyors divide it into neat parcels, indigenous nations live, hunt, trade, farm, travel, and build communities across these regions. Maize itself is part of that older history. The transformation of the Midwest into an American agricultural heartland takes place alongside treaties, forced removals, warfare, settlement, and the dispossession of native peoples. The straight lines that eventually appear on property maps are human decisions laid over a much older landscape. Then the plows arrive. Breaking prairie is hard work. Thick roots hold the soil together with astonishing strength. Early wooden plows can struggle in the heavy earth. Iron and steel plows improve the task. Horses and oxen lean into harnesses. Farmers walk behind, boots sinking into turned soil. The prairie opens, a field appears, then another. A cabin becomes a farmhouse, a path becomes a road, a cluster of buildings becomes a town, and into the dark soil goes corn. Spring begins with expectation. Seed is planted in rows. Rain darkens the earth. Tiny green shoots appear, almost delicate at first. Then warmth comes, and the plants rise. By midsummer, a person can disappear between the rows. The leaves brush against sleeves, insects move among the stalks. The air beneath the canopy feels different from the open road, humid and green, filled with the faint, dry whisper of leaves touching leaves. Corn has found extraordinary country, but growing abundance creates an old problem. What do you do with all of it? A farmer can feed his family, he can feed livestock, he can distill some grain, he can sell locally, yet there is a limit to how much a nearby village can consume. The true value of the Corn Belt will depend not only on what the soil can produce, but on whether that production can escape the farm. And so the history of corn becomes the history of transportation. Roads improve slowly. Rivers matter enormously. Canals create new connections, then comes the railroad. At first, the sound is unfamiliar. A distant whistle, metal against metal, smoke moving across the horizon. The locomotive approaches with a kind of mechanical confidence no horse can imitate. It does not care about tradition, it does not stop to admire the field, it arrives to move things, grain, livestock, timber tools, people, mail, news. A railway can turn a remote agricultural district into part of a national market. The effect on corn is profound. The farmer no longer needs to imagine only the nearest buyer. His harvest can travel. Corn grown hundreds of miles from a major city can enter commercial networks, connecting farms with processors, livestock markets, ports, and urban consumers. Distance begins to shrink economically even when it remains exactly the same geographically. A sack of grain that once had little value because hauling it overland cost too much can now be loaded onto a rail car. The old frontier problem is changing. Corn no longer needs to become whiskey merely to escape the mud. Iron rails can carry it. And where rails stop, towns grow. Picture a small Midwestern town on an autumn morning. The main street is not elegant. Dust or mud depends on the weather. Wooden storefronts face the road. Horses wait beside wagons. Somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rings. The railway line cuts past warehouses and loading areas. Farm wagons arrive carrying the harvest. Corn moves from field to wagon, from wagon to storage, from storage to railcar. Every transfer creates work. Someone weighs the grain. Someone records the transaction. Someone maintains the railway. Someone loads the cars. Someone sells supplies to the farmers arriving in town. Agricultural abundance supports businesses that do not grow crops at all. The town exists partly because the countryside produces more than the countryside itself can consume. And the countryside increasingly depends on the town for access to the wider world. The relationship tightens. Then storage changes. The old farm still has its crib and barn, but commercial agriculture requires larger systems. Grain elevators rise beside railway tracks. Silos and storage structures become landmarks of the agricultural landscape. They are not beautiful in the way a cathedral is beautiful, yet they serve a surprisingly similar purpose. They announce what the community believes is important. A medieval town might be recognized from a distance by its church tower. A grain town on the American plains may be recognized by storage rising above everything else. The message is clear. Food gathers here. Harvest becomes inventory. Corn becomes a number in a ledger. A farmer who once thought about whether the family had enough grain for winter now watches prices. How much is the crop worth? When should it be sold? What does transportation cost? What will next season require? The farm is becoming a business in a more complicated market, and as markets grow, farmers face pressure to produce more. For centuries, much agricultural work has depended upon muscle, human muscle, horse muscle, ox muscle. Planting, cultivating, harvesting, shelling, hauling, and processing require enormous labor. A farmer's acreage is limited partly by how much work a household and its animals can perform before the season moves on. Without them, nature does not extend planting time because someone is tired. A crop must be planted when conditions allow. Weeds must be controlled before they take over. Harvest must happen before weather destroys too much of the value. The calendar is merciless. Mechanization begins changing the calculation. New implements allow farmers to prepare soil more efficiently. Mechanical planters help place seed. Cultivators reduce some of the labor involved in controlling weeds. Harvesting equipment develops over time. Corn shellers make the task of separating kernels from cobs faster than endless hand labor. Each machine removes or reduces a bottleneck. At first, many devices are pulled by animals. The farm becomes an odd partnership between ancient biology and modern metal. A horse walks forward. Behind it is a machine that no farmer's distant ancestors could have imagined. Gears turn, blades move, wheels rotate. More work happens with each pass across the field. The farmer can manage more land. That changes the meaning of acreage. A field that once represented an exhausting limit becomes only part of the operation. More land can be planted. More corn can be harvested, more grain can be sold, and because more grain can be sold, buying machinery becomes easier to justify. The machine allows expansion. Expansion makes the machine more useful. The cycle begins feeding itself. But machinery is not free. A farmer must buy it, repair it, maintain it, and sometimes borrow money to obtain it. Now the farm depends not only on rain and soil, but on credit. manufacturers, spare parts, fuel, transportation, and market prices. Efficiency creates power. It also creates new forms of vulnerability. This pattern will become one of the defining features of modern agriculture. The farmer gains the ability to do more, and therefore must often do more. Autumn reveals the transformation most clearly. The corn has dried. Leaves turn pale and brittle. Fields that were green walls in summer become brown landscapes beneath a cooler sky. Wagons move, barns fill. Machinery works through long days. Dust clings to clothing. Hands become rough. Even with improved equipment, harvest remains demanding. There is always another row, another wagon, another load. At night, farmhouses glow faintly against the darkness. Families eat quickly and sleep heavily. Then morning comes, work begins again. Yet compare this farm with the tiny plots tended by distant ancestors, and the scale is astonishing. One household can now cultivate land that would once have required far more hands. A single farmer, supported by animals and machinery, begins to command an area that earlier agricultural communities might have associated with an entire group of workers. And the machines are only beginning. The next century will bring engines powerful enough to replace much of the animal labor. Tractors will cross fields where horses once walked. Mechanical harvesters will grow more capable. Trucks will join railways. Electricity will reach rural communities. Chemical fertilizers will alter the limits of soil fertility. Scientific breeding will change the seed itself. That last transformation is perhaps the strangest for thousands of years. Farmers had selected corn. They saved seed from plants they valued. They observed. They remembered. They chose. The basic idea had begun beside ancient fields in Mexico. But now laboratories, agricultural colleges, experiment stations, seed companies, and professional plant breeders begin entering the relationship. The seed is about to become technology. To understand why this matters, imagine a farmer selecting seed in the older way. At harvest, he notices strong plants and desirable ears. He saves kernels from promising corn for the next season. The method is sensible. It is also part of a long tradition that created maize in the first place. But plant breeding can become far more systematic. Researchers begin studying inheritance with increasing precision. They experiment with controlled pollination. They develop inbred lines and learn that crossing particular lines can produce hybrid offspring with impressive vigor and uniformity. The work is slow. Rows of experimental corn stand beneath summer sun. Researchers walk between them carrying notebooks. Plants are measured. Ears are examined. Pollination is controlled. Results are compared. Most experiments do not create miracles. That is how science usually works. There is a great deal of waiting, recording, disappointment, and trying again. But gradually, breeders learn how to produce hybrids that perform remarkably well. Hybrid corn begins spreading widely through American agriculture during the early 20th century. For farmers, the attraction is practical: better performance, greater uniformity, more dependable yields under suitable conditions. A field planted with successful hybrid seed can produce more than older varieties. The difference becomes difficult to ignore. Neighbors notice. Farmers talk. Seed companies advertise. Demonstration plots show what new hybrids can do. One farmer adopts them, then another. Soon the landscape begins changing again. But hybrid seed introduces a subtle shift in the farmer's relationship with corn. For thousands of years, seed saving has connected one harvest directly to the next. A farmer grows corn. He saves seed. He plants the descendants. With commercial hybrid systems, purchasing new seed becomes increasingly attractive because saved seed from hybrid plants does not reliably reproduce the same combination of desirable traits in the following generation. The seed is no longer merely part of the harvest. It is becoming an input, something purchased, something researched, something branded, something improved by specialists far from the farm. The farmer is still essential, but another figure has entered the field: the scientist, then the salesman. A seed catalogue arrives. Perhaps it lies on a kitchen table beside bills and newspapers. Inside are descriptions of varieties promising yield, strength, maturity at useful times, resistance to certain problems, and performance suited to particular conditions. Corn now comes with choices that sound increasingly technical. Which hybrid? Which soil? Which planting density? Which fertilizer? Which machinery? Which market? Agriculture begins accumulating decisions. The old farmer needed deep knowledge too, of course. Traditional farming was never simple. But the source of knowledge is changing. Some knowledge still lives in the family, some comes from neighbors, some comes from experience. Increasingly, some arrives from agricultural colleges, extension agents, government programs, scientific publications, and commercial companies. The farm is becoming connected to institutions, and those institutions want more yield. This desire seems entirely reasonable. More corn means more food, more animal feed, more marketable grain, more income when prices cooperate, more raw material for processors. But greater productivity also encourages greater specialization. If a region is exceptionally good at growing corn, why not grow more corn? If railways can move it, why not sell farther away? If livestock operations can consume enormous quantities, why not supply them? If industry can process corn into other products, why not build plants near the grain? The Corn Belt becomes more than a landscape. It becomes a system. Fields feed elevators. Elevators feed railways. Railways feed processors and livestock markets. Factories produce machinery. Banks provide credit. Seed companies develop hybrids. Researchers study soils and plants. Fertilizer industries support yields. Governments collect statistics and design agricultural policies. Universities train specialists. Weather reports become economically important across entire regions. A stalk of corn now stands at the center of a network it cannot possibly see. The farmer stands there too. On a summer evening, he may look across acres of green plants moving gently in the wind. The scene appears peaceful, yet behind that field is an industrial civilization. Steel made the machinery, fuel powers the tractor. Banks may have financed equipment, scientists develop the seed. Railways and roads will carry the harvest. Markets will determine the price. Livestock operations may consume the grain. Factories may transform it into products that no longer resemble corn. The field is no longer local even when it sits miles from the nearest city. This is one of the great changes of modern agriculture. A farm can be physically isolated and economically connected to half the world. The consequences are enormous. Yields rise, production expands, food systems support growing urban populations. Fewer people can produce food for many more people. That allows millions to leave agricultural work and enter factories, offices, universities, shops, armies, laboratories, and cities. Modern urban civilization rests partly on this agricultural transformation. A city worker can spend an entire life without planting corn, because somewhere else a farmer is producing far more corn than his own household could ever eat. But abundance creates its own questions. What happens when everyone produces more? Prices can fall. Farmers may need to grow still more to maintain income. More acreage requires larger machinery. Larger machinery requires more capital. The farm grows. The small operator feels pressure. Efficiency becomes not simply an advantage, but a demand. Grow more, harvest faster, reduce labor, increase yield. The quiet field begins to obey the rhythm of industry, even the plants become more uniform. Hybrid breeding encourages fields in which stalks mature in predictable ways. Uniformity makes mechanical farming easier. Machinery works best when crops behave consistently, so humans begin shaping corn not only for taste or survival, but for machines. The crop must fit the system, and the system in turn is built around the crop. This is a remarkable reversal. Long ago, Mesoamerican farmers adapted maize to human communities. Now modern societies begin adapting entire landscapes to maize. Roads lead toward elevators. Railways cross producing regions. Factories manufacture specialized equipment. Seed companies breed plants suited to large-scale agriculture. Universities study the crop. Governments measure it. Commodity markets price it. Banks finance it. Farmers organize their year around it. The plant has acquired an empire without ever asking for one. Stand beside a Midwestern cornfield, late in summer, and none of this is obvious. You hear insects, leaves rustle, perhaps a truck passes far away, the sun lowers. Rows disappear toward the horizon. It can seem timeless, but there is almost nothing timeless about the system surrounding those plants. The seed is the product of generations of breeding. The field may have been planted by a machine crossing many rows at once. Its fertility may depend partly on inputs produced far away. The harvest will be gathered by equipment capable of doing in hours what once demanded days of labor. The grain may enter storage almost immediately. From there, it can travel hundreds or thousands of miles. A farmer's distant ancestor might recognize the plant. He would struggle to recognize the farm, and soon even the grain's destination will become difficult to recognize. Some corn will still enter kitchens, much will feed livestock, but an increasing amount will enter factories. There, chemists and engineers will discover that a kernel can be separated into useful parts: starch, oil, sugars, alcohol, industrial ingredients. The cornfield will begin appearing inside products that do not look, smell, or taste like corn before that transformation fully arrives. However, the world will pass through an age of enormous wars. Industrial nations will mobilize millions of people. Cities will demand food while armies consume supplies on a scale earlier generals could scarcely imagine. Trains will carry soldiers toward battle and food toward soldiers. Factories will operate day and night. Horses, trucks, ships, railways, warehouses, farms, and kitchens will become pieces of vast logistical systems. And once again, behind the speeches and uniforms, there will be grain. So for a moment, remain in the corn belt at dusk. The railway signal changes in the distance. A freight train begins moving. Cars loaded with agricultural goods roll past darkened fields. Inside a farmhouse, tomorrow's work is already waiting. In a seed company, breeders are planning another experiment. In a city, traders watch prices. In a factory, engineers are designing a machine that will allow one farmer to manage still more land. The ancient partnership has changed. Human beings once shaped corn slowly, seed by seed. Now they are reshaping roads, machines, markets, science, and entire landscapes around it. And as the train disappears into the night, carrying the harvest toward places the farmer may never visit, corn enters the age when abundance itself becomes a form of power. Now we leave the quiet corn belt at dusk and follow the railway east, toward an age when trains no longer carry only harvests to peaceful markets. The whistle sounds in the darkness. Freight cars roll through sleeping towns. Somewhere ahead, factories glow beneath a smoky sky. Ports are crowded with ships, uniforms are being issued, horses are being gathered, and governments are discovering an ancient truth on a frightening new scale. War is hungry. It has always been hungry. The warrior carrying a spear needed food. The Roman legionary needed food. The medieval archer needed food. The cavalry horse needed fodder. Every army that ever marched carried a second army behind it, less famous and usually much dirtier, made up of wagons, animals, cooks, clerks, laborers, drivers, quartermasters, and exhausted people trying to make sure dinner arrived before the enemy did. But industrial war makes the appetite enormous. By the late 19th century and into the 20th, nations can mobilize forces on a scale that would have astonished earlier rulers. Railways move men rapidly across countries. Steamships cross oceans. Factories produce rifles, shells, uniforms, boots, vehicles, machinery, and the endless material required to keep modern armies functioning. Millions of people can be drawn into war, and every one of them must eat. This is where the heroic picture becomes less heroic and much more practical. Imagine a soldier standing beside a railway siding far from home. He has a rifle, he has ammunition, he has orders. But by evening, what he wants most may simply be something warm in a metal bowl. The stomach has little respect for military glory. A man can believe deeply in king, country, republic, revolution, duty or honor. By late afternoon, he also believes in supper. So behind every industrial army grows a vast system designed to move calories. Grain leaves farms, livestock leaves farms, canned goods leave factories, flour moves through mills, preserved meat moves through warehouses. Railway cars carry sacks, crates, barrels, and tins. Ships cross dangerous seas with holds full of food. Then the supplies must move again, from ports to depots, from depots to railheads, from railheads to smaller stations, from stations to wagons or trucks, and finally toward the people who will eat them. Corn enters this system in many forms. Sometimes it remains recognizable as grain or meal. Sometimes it feeds the animals that become meat. Sometimes it supports livestock needed by civilian populations. Sometimes its starch, oil, sugars, or alcohol enter industrial processes. The farther modern industry advances, the less necessary it becomes for corn to look like corn. But before reaching the factory, let us begin in the field. Morning comes to an American farm during wartime. There is no artillery here, no trench, no battlefield smoke, only dew. The corn stands in rows, a farmer steps outside before sunrise and begins another day. Perhaps members of the family have gone away to serve. Perhaps hired labor is difficult to find. Perhaps prices are changing quickly. Perhaps government messages encourage greater production. The war may be thousands of miles away. Yet it has entered the farm. The farmer notices it in labor shortages, in prices, in demand, in machinery, in newspapers, in letters arriving from sons or brothers overseas. The field is peaceful, but it is no longer separate from the conflict. Food has become strategic. This happens because industrial societies at war must solve two enormous problems at once. They must feed armies, and they must feed everyone who is not in the army. Factories do not operate on patriotism alone. A worker standing beside a machine for a long shift needs calories. Railway crews need food. Dock workers need food. Miners producing coal and metals need food. Women entering wartime industries in greater numbers need food. Children need food. The elderly need food. Cities continue waking every morning with the irritating expectation of breakfast. A government cannot simply send all available food to soldiers and tell everyone else to remain patient until the war ends. Civilian hunger can weaken production, damage morale, increase unrest, and create political crisis. So agriculture becomes part of national power, not in speeches alone, in arithmetic. How many acres are planted? How large is the harvest? How much grain can be stored? How much must remain for domestic use? How much can be exported? How much feed is available for livestock? How much transport capacity exists? A field that once belonged mainly to the rhythms of a family farm now appears inside government reports. Corn becomes a statistic. The statistic becomes a policy concern. The policy concern becomes another instruction sent back toward the countryside. Grow more, waste less, move it faster. The same crop once selected patiently by ancient farmers is now being counted by modern states. And still, beneath all the paperwork, the plant grows in exactly the old way. Seed, soil, water, sunlight, time. No government decree can order a drought to end. No general can command rain. Agriculture remains stubbornly biological inside an increasingly mechanical war that makes harvests both powerful and fragile. A good crop can support abundance. A poor crop can force difficult choices. Weather in one region can affect meals in another. Shipping losses can turn plenty on one side of an ocean into scarcity on the other. The distance between a cornfield and a soldier's mess tin is filled with opportunities for something to go wrong. So warehouses become important. Painfully important. History books rarely linger over warehouses because warehouses are difficult to make dramatic. They are large rooms where things wait, and waiting does not look heroic. Yet war depends on organized waiting. A sack of grain harvested in autumn may not be needed immediately. It must remain dry, protected, recorded, and available until someone requests it. A warehouse gives food time. Inside, the air smells of wood, dust, grain, burlap, oil, and sometimes rodents who have appointed themselves unofficial inspectors of military supply. Workers move through aisles. Clerks check inventories. Loads arrive, loads leave. Nothing here resembles a cavalry charge. But if the warehouse fails, the cavalry eventually notices. From storage, the grain moves toward railways. Here, the industrial age reveals its strength. A horse-drawn wagon can move useful quantities over limited distances. A train can move astonishing quantities across a continent. One locomotive pulls car after car, grain, meat, equipment, fuel, men. The railway timetable becomes part of military planning. A delay at one junction can ripple outward. A damaged bridge matters. A shortage of railcars matters. A congested port matters. War becomes a problem of flow. The front line consumes, the rear must replace. Again and again and again. A battle may last a day. Supply continues every day. That is the exhausting secret. The soldier fires ammunition, and more must arrive. He wears out boots, and more must arrive. He eats food, and tomorrow more must arrive. His horse eats fodder, and tomorrow the horse has made exactly the same unreasonable demand. Industrial armies may possess engines and machines, but horses remain enormously important well into the age of mechanized warfare. They pull artillery, they haul wagons, they carry supplies, they move where vehicles sometimes cannot. And horses are magnificent logistical problems. A horse eats whether a battle is won or lost. It does not become patriotic and skip lunch. It needs substantial quantities of fodder. Multiply that appetite across enormous numbers of animals, and suddenly the supply of feed becomes a military issue. Corn and other grains can form part of these feeding systems, depending on region, availability, and military practice. The animal standing behind the lines therefore connects back to farmland. A field feeds a horse. The horse pulls a wagon. The wagon carries shells or food. The supplies reach soldiers. The chain is simple enough to describe. Maintaining it across great distances is not simple at all. Now follow some of the corn in another direction. Instead of remaining whole, it enters a processing plant. The building is louder than the barn. Belts move. Metal machinery turns. Steam gathers. Workers monitor equipment. The kernel is cleaned, crushed, separated, ground, or transformed according to what the plant produces. Corn is no longer merely food. Its components have industrial value. Starch has uses beyond the kitchen. Corn oil becomes useful in food production. Alcohol produced from agricultural material can serve industrial purposes. Sweeteners and other derivatives will become increasingly important as processing technology develops. The kernel is being taken apart. This ability matters in wartime because industrial economies seek usefulness everywhere. A crop that can feed people, feed animals, and provide raw material for manufacturing is unusually valuable. Nothing needs to be magical. Scale is enough. A tiny amount of useful material may seem unimportant. Multiply it across millions of bushels, and suddenly it becomes an industry. This is one of the defining habits of industrial civilization. Take something ordinary, process it, standardize it, move it. Use it in quantities so large that ordinary becomes strategic. Corn fits beautifully into this world. Its great strength is not that it performs one spectacular task, it performs many dull tasks extremely well. And wars are won partly through dull tasks. Someone must fill the sack. Someone must inspect the grain. Someone must drive the truck. Someone must shovel coal. Someone must repair the locomotive. Someone must load the ship. Someone must unload the ship. Someone must count the crates. Someone must cook the meal. The general appears in photographs. The supply clerk appears in paperwork. Yet remove enough supply clerks and the general soon has a serious problem. The connection between agricultural abundance and industrial strength becomes especially clear during the great wars of the 20th century. A nation capable of producing large food surpluses possesses an advantage extending far beyond domestic comfort. It can feed armed forces abroad. It can support allies. It can sustain industrial workers at home. It can replace losses in supply chains. It can preserve scarce labor through mechanized farming. It can turn agricultural productivity into strategic endurance. This last word matters. Endurance. Wars are not always decided by who strikes hardest at the beginning. Sometimes they are decided by who can continue. Another month, another winter, another harvest, another shipment, another production cycle. A country may possess brilliant soldiers and still be weakened if its population cannot eat properly. An army may win battles and still fail if its supply system collapses. A factory may have machinery but little output if workers are hungry. Food becomes a form of staying power. Corn contributes to that staying power as one crop among many. It should not be exaggerated into the single grain that wins wars. Wheat matters enormously, potatoes matter, rice matters in other regions. Meat, dairy, sugar, fats, vegetables, fisheries, and imported foods all enter wartime diets and supply systems. But corn has become part of the agricultural depth behind American industrial power. It is abundant. It stores, it feeds livestock. It can be processed. It travels through the same rail and commercial networks that earlier generations built across the Corn Belt. The system developed for peacetime commerce can be redirected toward war. A grain elevator does not need to understand geopolitics. It stores grain either way. A railway built to carry harvests toward markets can also carry military supplies. A processing plant built to transform agricultural products can respond to new demands. Infrastructure created for profit becomes infrastructure for national mobilization. And the people operating it experience war in ways quite different from the soldier. Consider the farmer at home. He reads headlines about distant battles. Perhaps he knows someone there. Then he looks at his own field. His work can feel absurdly ordinary compared with what the newspaper describes. There are weeds, there is machinery to repair, there is a fence leaning at an angle it has apparently chosen for itself. There is weather. There is always weather. Yet his harvest enters the same national effort. He may be asked to increase production while labor is scarce. Mechanization helps. Tractors and other equipment allow fewer people to work larger areas. The long transformation we watched in the Corn Belt now becomes strategically useful. A farm dependent entirely on large numbers of laborers suffers when young workers leave for military service or industrial jobs. A mechanized farm can continue producing with fewer hands, not effortlessly, but more effectively. Technology converts fuel and machinery into agricultural labor. The tractor becomes part of the war economy without ever leaving the field. Now consider the factory worker. She may spend long hours beside machinery processing food or manufacturing materials needed elsewhere. The work is repetitive, the air may be hot. Noise fills the building. Clothes smell of oil, dust, grain, or whatever the factory handles. There are quotas, schedules, supervisors, fatigue. She does not see the soldier who eventually benefits from the system. The soldier does not see her. This distance is one of the strange features of industrial war. People become connected without meeting. A farmer in Iowa grows corn. A railway worker moves it. A processor transforms it. Another worker packs a product. A truck driver carries it. A dock worker loads it. A sailor crosses the ocean with it. A quartermaster receives it. A cook prepares something from the larger stream of supplies. A soldier eats. Most links in the chain know almost nothing about the others, yet each depends upon the previous one. This is what industrial capacity really means when stripped of impressive language. It means many people doing specialized jobs reliably enough that a person far away receives what is needed. Corn moves through this network almost anonymously. That anonymity is important. A soldier opening a ration does not necessarily see a cornfield. A worker eating meat may not see the grain that helped feed the animal. A factory using starch does not resemble a farm. The crop disappears into systems. Its influence grows as its visibility declines. And while armies move across maps, governments increasingly manage civilian consumption as well. Wartime shortages encourage rationing, conservation, substitution, and campaigns against waste. Citizens are reminded that food has national importance. A kitchen can become part of wartime discipline. Use less of this, save that. Grow something at home, do not waste bread, preserve food, accept substitutes. The language differs by country and conflict, but the principle is familiar. The civilian table and the battlefield belong to the same supply problem. Every pound consumed here is a pound unavailable elsewhere. Every shipment lost must be replaced. Every harvest becomes part of a national calculation. The old separation between farm and state grows thinner. Agricultural departments gather information, scientists advise farmers, governments influence prices and production. Transportation is coordinated, processing industries expand. Food becomes organized at scales earlier generations could barely imagine. Yet organization does not eliminate uncertainty. A storm can still flatten crops. Disease can affect livestock. Machinery can fail. Rail lines can be attacked. Ships can be sunk. Workers can strike. Fuel can become scarce. Bureaucracies can make mistakes. A perfectly designed plan eventually meets an actual Tuesday afternoon. Then someone must improvise. That someone is rarely famous. Perhaps it is a station manager finding space for another freight car. Perhaps a mechanic working through the night. Perhaps a farm woman doing the work of relatives who have gone away. Perhaps a warehouse crew loading sacks under weak electric lights. Perhaps a driver who has not slept enough. Perhaps a cook stretching supplies farther than regulations intended. History tends to compress these people into words like logistics. It is a useful word. It is also unfairly clean. Logistics is cold fingers tying rope. It is a sore back lifting crates. It is mud around a wheel. It is grease beneath fingernails. It is paperwork completed at midnight. It is spoiled food discovered at exactly the wrong moment. It is a train arriving late. It is another train somehow arriving on time. It is thousands of ordinary failures being repaired before they become extraordinary disasters. Corn belongs to this unglamorous world. The grain waits in storage, then it moves. Perhaps to livestock, perhaps to a mill, perhaps to a factory, perhaps toward export. It does not know whether the destination is civilian or military. But its abundance gives planners choices, and choices are power. A country producing barely enough food for itself has little room for disruption. A country producing large surpluses can absorb shocks, supply distant forces, support partners, and redirect resources. The industrial farm therefore becomes something like a quiet arsenal. Not because its machines fire shells, because it produces endurance. This is the part of war monuments rarely show. There are statues of soldiers, there are statues of generals. There are memorials to battles and ships. Very few monuments depict a tired man loading sacks of grain onto a railway car. Perhaps they should, for imagine the alternative. The general gives an order, the troops advance. Then the food does not arrive. At first, soldiers complain, then they weaken. Animals lose condition, movement slows, illness increases, morale falls. Foraging begins, local populations suffer, discipline becomes harder, plans shrink to match empty stomachs. The grand strategy is defeated by missing breakfast. There is something almost comforting in the humility of this. Human beings build enormous machines of power. They create uniforms, flags, doctrines, artillery, engines, and bureaucracies. Then biology quietly reminds everyone that the machine is made of animals, human animals, horse animals, living bodies requiring water and energy. No ideology can repeal digestion. And so the cornfield remains important. Far from explosions, leaves move in summer wind. A farmer watches the sky. He is concerned about rain. A general on another continent may be concerned about an offensive. The two worries seem unrelated. They are not. If enough fields fail, strategy changes. If enough harvests succeed, options expand. Sunlight becomes grain, grain becomes calories, calories become labor. Labor becomes industrial production supports war. The chain begins quietly. That is perhaps why it is so easy to overlook. By the time the great industrial wars end, the agricultural system has changed again. Mechanization has advanced. Scientific breeding has spread. Processing capacity has expanded. Transportation networks have become more powerful. Governments and corporations understand more clearly than ever that corn is not merely something to eat from a cob. It is a raw material. And raw materials invite experimentation. What else can be extracted from the kernel? What else can starch become? Can corn provide sweeter substances? Can its oil be separated more efficiently? Can fermentation turn it into useful chemicals or fuels? Can industry find markets for every fraction of the grain? The questions are no longer being asked only in farm kitchens. They are being asked in laboratories and factories. The next transformation will be quieter than war, but perhaps even more complete. Corn is about to disappear, not from the landscape. The fields will become larger than ever. Corn will disappear from sight by entering products in forms that no longer resemble the original grain. Before we follow it into that strange industrial future, stay for a moment beside a railway platform during wartime. Night has fallen. A worker stands beside a freight car. His coat is dusty. His shoulders ache. He has been loading supplies for hours. Somewhere far away, people are writing tomorrow's headlines. They will mention commanders. They will mention armies. They will mention victories and defeats. They will describe movements on maps with arrows sweeping across borders. They will probably not mention him. He lifts another sack. Inside is food grown by someone else he will never meet. He carries it toward the waiting train. The locomotive breathes steam into the darkness. Then the train begins to move. The worker watches until the final car disappears. History will remember where the army marched. It will remember who commanded it. But somewhere behind every famous advance was a nameless person who loaded the food onto the train. And somewhere behind that person, almost silent beneath the summer sky, was a field. Now we leave the railway platform and follow the grain into a different kind of darkness. Not the darkness of a barn, not the darkness beneath a freight car, the darkness of a factory. Outside, corn still grows in rows beneath the sun. The leaves still rustle. The stalks still rise from soil in the old way. A farmer can still break an ear from the plant and hold it in his hand exactly as farmers have done for generations. But inside the factory, the meaning of corn begins to change. The building hums. Steam drifts near pipes and valves. Metal surfaces shine beneath electric lights. Belts move, pumps throb, water runs through channels and tanks. Somewhere, machinery grinds with a low mechanical patience that never seems tired. The smell is strange, part grain, part dampness, part heat, part something almost sweet. A truck arrives carrying corn. The kernels enter one side of the building. What leaves the other side may no longer look like food at all. This is one of the most important transformations in the long history of maize. For thousands of years, people asked a simple question: how do we eat this? Now industry begins asking a different one: what is this made of? The difference sounds small. It is not. A cook looks at corn and sees a meal. A farmer sees a crop. A merchant sees a commodity. A chemist sees components: starch, oil, protein, fiber. Sugars waiting to be created through processing. Material that can be fermented, material that can be dried, refined, separated, modified, sold, and combined with other materials. The kernel becomes less like a single object and more like a small warehouse. Industrial science learns how to open the doors. The basic idea begins long before the 20th century reaches its full industrial rhythm. Corn milling already exists in different forms, and manufacturers have long understood that grain can be ground, separated, fermented, and processed. But modern industry changes the scale and precision. The kernel can be treated with water. It can be softened. It can be ground. Different parts can be separated according to their physical properties. The germ, rich in oil, can go in one direction. The starch can go in another. Fiber can be collected. Protein can be used. Nothing appears impressive when viewed alone. A pale powder, a yellowish oil, a wet mass, a clear syrup. Yet these humble materials are enormously useful because manufacturers can turn them into other things. Corn starch becomes especially important. To the eye, starch is not dramatic. It is white, soft, powdery. It does not announce that it came from a tall plant standing beneath the Midwestern sun, that anonymity is part of its power. Starch can thicken foods. It can influence texture. It can bind. It can coat. It can be modified for different industrial uses. It can enter paper production, textiles, adhesives, pharmaceuticals, and countless manufactured goods. Corn has moved beyond the kitchen without leaving it. A single crop now feeds both appetite and industry. Imagine a worker standing beside a large processing vessel. He does not see fields. He sees gauges. He listens for changes in machinery. He smells wet grain and heated metal. A pipe carries material away. Another brings water in. The process continues hour after hour. The factory has one great advantage over the household kitchen. It can repeat again, 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 the same process applied to enormous quantities of grain. Consistency becomes valuable. Industry prefers things that behave predictably. The starch should meet a standard. The oil should meet a standard. The syrup should meet a standard. The raw corn arriving from farms must therefore enter a world where variation is measured, controlled, and reduced where possible. This helps reshape agriculture in return. Processors want dependable supplies. Manufacturers want predictable inputs. Farmers grow enormous quantities of corn suited to commercial systems. Railways and trucks carry it, elevators store it, factories take it apart. The loop tightens, corn is no longer only adapting to climate or taste. It is adapting to industrial demand, and demand is remarkably creative. Take the oil. Corn germ contains oil that can be separated and refined. The resulting product can enter cooking, food manufacturing, and other uses. Again, the final bottle may show no obvious connection to the field, except perhaps a small word on a label. The original plant has disappeared. The same happens with starch, and then with sweeteners. Cornstarch is built from chains of glucose. Industrial chemistry learns how to break those chains down and turn starch into glucose syrups and other sweet products. Later, additional processing allows some of the glucose to be converted into fructose, producing syrups that become useful to food manufacturers for sweetness, handling, stability, and cost under certain market conditions. This is where the story of corn becomes especially strange. For most of human history, if someone ate corn, they knew it. There was little room for confusion. The cob sat in front of them. The porridge tasted like maize. The tortilla began with maize. The animal feed looked like grain, but now a person can consume something made partly from corn without seeing a kernel. The corn may be in a syrup, or a starch, or an oil, or an ingredient produced through fermentation. It may contribute texture rather than flavor. It may help keep a product stable. It may coat another food. It may sweeten something. It may simply make a manufacturing process easier. Corn becomes useful precisely because it can vanish. And this vanishing act grows alongside the rise of processed food. The 20th century changes how millions of people buy and eat. Cities grow, households change, food factories become larger, packaging improves. Refrigeration expands. Supermarkets gather products from many producers beneath one roof. Manufacturers learn that food can be designed not only for nourishment, but also for shelf life, convenience, texture, transport, appearance, consistency, and cost. The old village meal depends on what is nearby and in season. The industrial food system dreams of sameness. A product bought in one city should resemble the same product bought far away. A sauce should pour in a familiar way. A snack should crunch in a familiar way. A sweet drink should taste the same from one batch to the next. Starch, oils, syrups, and other processed ingredients help make this possible. Corn enters the architecture of consistency. A shopper does not see the architecture. That is the point. Imagine walking into a grocery store several generations ago, after industrial food processing has become well established. The shelves are bright. Boxes stand in rows. Bottles catch the light. Packages promise convenience. There are cereals, sauces, baked goods, sweets, canned foods, prepared foods, drinks, frozen products, and snacks. The shopper walks past hundreds of items. She sees tomatoes printed on one label, chocolate on another, a smiling child on a box, a farm scene on a package, a bowl of soup, a loaf of bread, a bottle of dressing. Corn may be present in many of them, yet there may not be a single ear of corn pictured anywhere nearby. This is the sense in which corn begins to fool the world, not through a conspiracy. Not because scientists are hiding a secret plot in the basement of a factory. The reality is more ordinary and therefore more interesting. Corn becomes so useful as a raw material that it stops needing to look like itself. The crop becomes invisible through success. That invisibility changes how people understand what they eat. A farmer sees acres of corn, a processor sees starch and oil, a manufacturer sees ingredients, a shopper sees products. Each person is looking at the same agricultural system from a different distance. The farther the shopper stands from the field, the harder the field becomes to see, and distance grows. Earlier in our story, a person could often understand a meal by looking at it. Bread came from grain, cheese came from milk, meat came from an animal. Beans were beans. An apple was not attempting to disguise its background. Industrial food complicates this relationship. A finished product may contain ingredients from many farms, many factories, and many regions. One box can represent a network: grain from here, oil from there, sugar from somewhere else, flavorings from another facility, packaging from another industry entirely, transport joining everything together. Food begins to resemble manufacturing. The recipe becomes a supply chain. Corn thrives in this environment because it is abundant and flexible. Its starch can become a platform for other ingredients. Its sugars can enter beverages and packaged foods. Its oil can enter cooking and manufacturing. Its fermentation products can become useful industrial compounds. Its remaining fractions can become animal feed. The factory learns to waste very little. What cannot become one product may become another. This is economically powerful. A kernel enters the plant. Different streams leave. Each stream can have a market. The cornfield now feeds not one industry but several. And every new use creates more reason to grow corn. More demand supports more acreage. More acreage supports larger storage systems. Larger supply supports larger processing plants. Larger plants search for more markets. The system expands outward and inward at the same time. Outward across the landscape, inward into the chemistry of the kernel. This is a curious form of conquest. Corn does not march into a city, it dissolves into it. It enters a bakery as starch. It enters a soft drink as sweetener. It enters a factory as alcohol. It enters a bottle as oil. It enters an animal as feed and returns as meat. It enters packaging, paper, adhesives, and industrial processes in forms that would seem almost magical to the ancient farmers who first selected teosinte. The plant has not changed its basic ambition. It still wants sunlight, water, soil, and time. Human ambition has changed around it. Scientists and manufacturers become increasingly interested in the idea that agricultural products can serve as chemical feedstocks. Why depend only on materials dug from the ground if some useful molecules can be grown? Why sell corn only as food if parts of the kernel can command value elsewhere? The field becomes a kind of biological factory, supplying the mechanical factory. Sunlight creates plant matter. Industry separates and redirects it. This is efficient in one sense. It is also strangely beautiful if viewed from far enough away. A beam of sunlight falls on a leaf in Iowa. Months later, some portion of the energy and material captured there may exist in a product sold hundreds of miles away. The person buying it may never know. That gap between origin and awareness becomes larger as processed food expands after the Great Wars. Food companies invest heavily in research. Chemists study texture. Engineers study preservation. Manufacturers seek ingredients that behave reliably under heat, cold, mixing, pumping, packaging, storage, and transport. The humble corn kernel becomes a laboratory favorite because it can provide several useful substances at large scale. One of the simplest is starch. Starch can change the thickness of a sauce. It can help prevent ingredients from separating. It can improve the feel of a product in the mouth. Modified starches can be tailored for specific manufacturing needs. The word modified may sound dramatic. Usually, the reality is much duller. Industry wants starch to behave in a certain way, so it changes how the starch behaves. Perhaps it must tolerate heating, perhaps freezing, perhaps acidity, perhaps vigorous mixing. The ingredient becomes a tool, the shopper experiences only the result. The soup has the expected texture. The filling does not leak. The sauce remains smooth. The package opens. Dinner happens. No one thinks about Iowa. That is industrial success. The machinery becomes invisible when it works. Corn oil follows a similar path into kitchens and factories. Refined oil has different properties from the whole kernel. It can be transported, bottled, mixed, and used without carrying the obvious flavor or appearance of corn. The crop becomes neutral. Neutrality is commercially useful. A strong flavor limits where an ingredient can go. A mild ingredient can go almost anywhere. Sweeteners push the invisibility further. A consumer tasting sweetness may think of sugarcane or sugar beets if they think of the source at all, but corn can enter sweetness through starch conversion. The path is not intuitive. Corn does not look sweet enough to become syrup. Yet chemistry is not interested in appearance. Starch is made from glucose units. Break the structure apart and sweetness emerges. Process it further, and different sweetener profiles become possible. The field has become dessert without ever passing through the familiar stage of corn on the cob. This does not mean corn sweeteners instantly replace older forms of sugar. Markets are shaped by prices, policies, trade, technology, consumer habits, and manufacturing needs. Different sweeteners compete and coexist. But once corn becomes a practical source of sweetness, another enormous market opens. The same crop, already feeding livestock and supplying starch, now enters drinks and packaged foods in a new way. Corn does not need a new field, it needs a new factory process. And the 20th century is very good at factory processes. The industrial system becomes more integrated. Farmers deliver standardized crops. Processors separate components. Food companies formulate products. Distributors move them. Retailers display them. Advertising creates desire. Consumers choose. Then the entire chain begins again with next year's planting. Somewhere inside this cycle, the original plant becomes almost philosophical. What is corn now? Is it the yellow ear in a summer market? Is it the starch thickening a sauce? Is it the feed consumed by a chicken? Is it the glucose fermented into alcohol? Is it the oil in a bottle? Is it the sweetener in a drink? The answer is yes. Corn is becoming less an object and more a system. This is why the title of our story can sound playful when it says corn fooled the world. The trick is not deception in the ordinary sense. No colonel has forged documents. No stork is hiding behind a curtain. The trick is that modern industry has learned to separate appearance from origin. A product can come from corn without resembling corn. Once this happens, the consumer's senses are no longer enough to explain the food system. Sight cannot tell the whole story. Taste cannot tell the whole story. Even smell may reveal nothing. To know where food comes from, a person increasingly needs labels, supply chains, industrial knowledge, and sometimes a surprisingly patient willingness to read very small print. That is a profound historical change. For most of humanity's existence, the distance between food and knowledge was shorter. A family might not understand nutrition scientifically, but they often knew the visible origin of what they ate. The bread began with local grain. The eggs came from nearby hens. The meat had once stood in a field or pen. Industrial civilization creates foods with hidden biographies. Corn becomes one of the greatest authors of those biographies. A bottle may have begun partly in a field. A snack may have begun partly in a field. A sauce may have begun partly in a field. A piece of meat may have begun with an animal whose own growth depended partly on a field. The landscape enters the supermarket in disguise. There is another reason this matters. When people stop recognizing how much they depend on a crop, the crop can become politically and economically important without being culturally visible. Wheat still looks like bread in the public imagination. Rice still looks like rice. Corn, increasingly, looks like everything and nothing that makes it difficult to understand how large its role has become. A person may say they rarely eat corn while consuming products connected to corn several times in a day. The breakfast cereal may contain corn ingredients. The sweetener in a drink may come from corn. The meat at lunch may come from animals fed partly on corn. The sauce may use corn starch. The cooking oil may come from corn. The dessert may contain a corn-derived sweetener. The person has spent the day moving through a corn economy without seeing a cob. This is not necessarily good or bad in every individual case. History is not helped by turning every transformation into a moral fable. Industrial processing brings real benefits. Food becomes more stable, more transportable, more consistent, in many places, more affordable. Factories can produce enormous quantities. Supply chains can feed dense urban populations. Ingredients derived from corn can perform useful tasks efficiently, but every gain changes the shape of dependence. The ancient farmer depended on rain. The modern food company may depend on predictable deliveries of refined starch. The 19th century farmer worried about the local market. The 20th century processor watches global commodity flows. The household once stored grain. Now corporations store ingredients. Scale expands. And when scale expands, small changes begin having enormous effects. A shift in corn prices can affect livestock producers. A drought can ripple through food manufacturers. A policy affecting ethanol or feed can influence demand for grain. A change in processing technology can create an entirely new market. The field is now connected to decisions made in boardrooms, laboratories, legislatures, commodity exchanges, and industrial plants. Corn has become modern, or perhaps modernity has become corn-shaped. Late at night, the factory keeps running. That is one of the great differences between the industrial world and the agricultural one. The field sleeps. The machines do not have to. Electric light shines across metal walkways. Motors continue turning. Pumps continue moving liquid. Workers change shifts. A truck arrives, another leaves. Inside, the kernel is reduced to fractions. Outside, no one passing on the road would guess how many future products are moving through those pipes. Soon, those products will travel outward, into supermarkets, into kitchens, into restaurants, into animal feedlots, into bottles and boxes and bags. Corn is preparing to surround the consumer so completely that recognizing it will become almost impossible. The strange part is that the cornfield itself will remain visible. Drive through the American Midwest in summer, and it is difficult to miss. Rows stretch toward the horizon, field after field, green walls beside roads. The crop is physically obvious in the countryside, yet culturally, inside the city, it becomes hidden. This is one of the great contradictions of industrial food. The source grows larger, the source becomes harder to see. And perhaps that is the real illusion. Not that corn disappears, it becomes too successful to remain recognizable. So let us leave the factory for a moment. Behind us, steam rises, metal vibrates, wet grain moves through pipes. A worker checks a gauge. Somewhere inside the building, starch is being separated from oil, sugars are being created from starch, and the old kernel is being divided into futures. Ahead of us are bright supermarket doors. They slide open. Cool air spills outward. Inside are thousands of products waiting beneath fluorescent light. We are about to walk through the modern food system slowly, shelf by shelf. And if we look carefully enough, we may discover that the cornfield followed us inside long before we noticed. Now we step through the bright supermarket doors. The factory is behind us, but its work is everywhere. Cool air settles against the skin. Fluorescent lights hum above polished floors. Shopping carts rest in a long metal row near the entrance. Somewhere, a refrigerator compressor starts with a low mechanical shudder. Somewhere else, a bottle is placed back on a shelf with a soft glass click. It is late enough to feel quiet. The crowds have thinned. A worker straightens boxes in one aisle. Another pushes a pallet through a distant doorway. And around us stand thousands of products, each with its own colors, promises, labels, and careful little image of what it wants us to believe it is. Bread looks like bread. Sauce looks like sauce. Meat looks like meat. Breakfast cereal looks like cheerful shapes inside a cardboard box. Corn does not appear to be in charge of anything. That is the trick. We begin in the beverage aisle. Rows of bottles catch the light. Dark cola, orange drink, lemon drink, sports drinks, sweet teas, fruit-flavored beverages. The colors are bright enough to make the whole aisle seem slightly unreal. A shopper reaches for a bottle and sees a brand, a flavor, a promise of refreshment. What the shopper does not see is a cornfield. Yet in many products, especially in the United States during the rise of modern processed food, corn-derived sweeteners become part of the formula. One of the most famous is high-fructose corn syrup. The name sounds complicated, but the basic path is not difficult to follow. Corn is milled, its starch is separated, the starch is broken down into glucose, then some of that glucose is converted into fructose. The result is a liquid sweetener that can be pumped, transported, measured, blended, and used efficiently by large food manufacturers. It does not look like corn. It does not taste like corn. It does not behave like a cob, a kernel, or a bowl of polenta. The plant has become chemistry, and chemistry has become a bottle. There is no secret room here, no conspiracy, no shadowy council plotting beneath the supermarket. The process is more ordinary than that. Manufacturers have a problem. They need sweetness, they need consistency, they need ingredients that move easily through industrial systems. Corn can provide those things, so it does. And once it does, the shopper can drink something connected to a Midwestern cornfield without ever thinking about agriculture. We push the cart forward. The wheels make a faint, uneven rattle. Now the cereal aisle. This is one of the more obvious places. Cornflakes have never made much effort to hide their ancestry. Corn cereals announce themselves proudly. Yellow kernels become flakes, puffs, rings, squares, and shapes that nature made no attempt to invent. Yet even here, corn's presence can be stranger than it looks. A cereal may contain corn as its main grain. Another may contain corn syrup or cornstarch. Another may use corn-derived ingredients only in small amounts. The box is not simply food, it is the final stage of several industrial histories. The grain was grown, harvested, dried, stored, transported, milled, cooked, shaped, sweetened, toasted, packaged, loaded onto another truck, placed on a shelf. The journey from soil to breakfast has become so smooth that almost all of it disappears from view. A child pours cereal into a bowl, milk follows, a spoon clinks against ceramic. Breakfast lasts perhaps a few minutes. The supply chain behind it took months. That is modern abundance in miniature, enormous complexity presenting itself as something simple. We move on. Bread. The shelves are soft with plastic packages. White loaves, whole grain loaves, rolls, buns, cakes, pastries. The obvious grain here is usually wheat. Corn seems to have stepped aside, but read enough ingredient lists and its quiet relatives can reappear. Cornstarch may contribute to texture or processing. Corn-derived sweeteners may appear in some products. Corn oil may appear elsewhere. Corn flour or corn meal may be used in particular breads, coatings, or baked goods. The point is not that every loaf is secretly made of maize, it is that modern food products are networks. A product can remain mostly wheat and still depend on corn somewhere inside its design. Then the sauces: ketchup, barbecue sauce, salad dressing, marinades, prepared gravies, condiments arranged in neat rows. Some are thick, some are glossy. Some cling perfectly to food because someone spent a great deal of time making sure they would. Starch can help create that texture. Sweeteners can balance acidity or shape flavor. Corn oil can enter recipes. The cornfield has found another disguise. A spoonful of sauce is no longer merely tomatoes, vinegar, salt, spices, or sugar in the old household sense. It may be an engineered combination designed to remain stable during transport, storage, opening, refrigeration, and repeated use. The sauce must behave. Modern food is expected to behave. It should pour when asked. It should not separate too quickly. It should taste familiar. It should survive a journey longer than most medieval travelers. Corn-derived ingredients help with this quiet discipline. We turn into the snack aisle. Here corn sometimes stops pretending. Corn chips, popcorn, cheese-flavored corn snacks, tortilla chips. Crackers made partly from corn. The ancient grain appears in forms that would be both recognizable and bewildering to its first cultivators. A person in ancient Mesoamerica would understand that this food began with maize. What might be harder to understand is everything surrounding it. The factory seasoning, the printed bag, the artificial atmosphere inside the package, the national distribution system, the advertising campaign. The fact that a snack made in one place can taste nearly identical thousands of miles away. The flavor has become industrial memory. A customer expects the same experience. That expectation requires control. Control requires standardized ingredients. Standardized ingredients reward large-scale crops. And once again, the field feeds the factory. But the strangest aisle has not appeared yet. We move toward meat. Packages of beef rest beneath cold light. Chicken breasts, ground meat, pork, prepared sausages. Frozen meals at first. Corn seems absent. There are no kernels, no yellow cobs, no sacks of grain, only animal flesh. And here we should ask a slightly uncomfortable but useful question. Is a steak another way of looking at a cornfield? Not entirely. Cattle are ruminants. Their natural feeding systems are tied deeply to grasses and forage, and livestock production varies widely by place, farm, climate, and method. But in modern American beef production, corn and other energy-dense feeds have often played a major role in finishing cattle before slaughter. The animal may spend much of its life eating grass or forage. Later, In certain production systems, grain-rich feed helps it gain weight efficiently. Corn becomes animal growth. Then the animal becomes beef. The shopper sees a steak, the field has vanished again. This disappearance is even more complete with chicken. Modern poultry production can depend heavily on formulated feeds made from grains and protein sources. Corn is often a major source of energy in those feeds. A chicken eats corn. The corn becomes muscle. The muscle becomes meat. The meat becomes a packaged product. The package says chicken. The corn has performed its disappearing act perfectly. The same logic applies in different ways to pork. Pigs have eaten corn for centuries, as we saw back in the muddy barns of Europe and the American frontier. Industrial livestock production simply expands the scale. Feed is formulated, growth is measured. Animals are raised within systems designed to turn agricultural inputs into animal protein. With predictable efficiency, corn becomes part of a biological factory. The animal is alive, of course. That makes the phrase uncomfortable. But economically, the system measures conversion. Feed goes in, weight increases. Meat comes out. The ancient pig beside the barn trough has become part of a modern supply chain, and the cornfield has become an unseen ingredient in the meat aisle. This is where the supermarket begins to feel almost haunted by agriculture. Not in a frightening way, in a quiet way. The shelves are full of landscapes that no longer look like landscapes. A bottle of soda may contain the history of a cornfield. A chicken breast may contain the history of a cornfield. A box of cereal certainly may. A sauce bottle may. A frozen dinner may contain several separate paths back to corn at once. The meat may come from an animal-fed corn. The sauce may contain cornstarch. The sweetener may come from corn. The oil used in preparation may come from corn. The packaging may even involve industrial materials whose production touches agricultural chemistry in ways the shopper never sees. The field has multiplied itself into forms. This is why the modern supermarket represents such a remarkable turning point. Earlier societies usually understood food through visible categories: grain, meat, fruit, milk, vegetables, salt, oil. The modern store still uses those categories to organize aisles. But beneath them lies another structure: ingredients, feedstocks, processing aids, commodity flows. Corn belongs to that hidden structure. A shopper may believe they are choosing between unrelated products. In agricultural terms, some of those products may be cousins. We keep walking: frozen foods, pizza, prepared dinners, breaded chicken, vegetable mixtures, desserts, ice cream. Meals designed to travel from freezer to oven or microwave with very little human effort. Convenience is one of the great achievements of modern food manufacturing. It is easy to mock convenience until one remembers what food preparation once required. Firewood had to be collected, water had to be carried, grain had to be ground. Meat had to be butchered, preserved, or cooked before spoilage. Bread required time, vegetables followed seasons. A household kitchen could consume enormous amounts of labor. Modern processed food reduces much of that labor. A package can turn hours into minutes. But the labor has not disappeared. It has moved into farms, factories, warehouses, laboratories, packaging plants, distribution centers, truck routes, refrigerated storage. Someone else has done the work earlier. Corn fits this shift perfectly because it can be processed centrally and distributed widely. Its starch can help stabilize foods through freezing and reheating. Its sweeteners can survive industrial handling. Its oils can enter recipes at scale. Its feed can support the animals whose meat becomes frozen dinners. Corn becomes part of convenience itself. The shopper rarely thanks it. Corn probably manages. Then there is packaging. This part of the aisle may seem far removed from agriculture. Plastic films, paperboard boxes, coatings, adhesives, labels. The container is not food, yet packaging belongs to the food system as surely as the food does. Without packaging, many modern products could not travel safely or remain stable long enough to reach distant customers. Cornstarch has long had industrial uses in paper, cardboard, and adhesives. More recently, corn-derived materials have also been used in certain bioplastics and packaging experiments. Again, the point is not that every package is made from maize. Most are not. The larger point is stranger. Corn can participate in the supermarket even when no one is eating it. The crop has escaped the category of food. That escape is what makes it so difficult to see. If corn only appeared as kernels, counting corn would be easy. Walk through the produce section, find the ears, done. But industrial civilization has taught corn to change costumes. The kernel becomes starch, the starch becomes syrup. The syrup becomes soda. The germ becomes oil. The grain becomes feed. The feed becomes meat. The starch becomes adhesive. The crop becomes an industrial molecule. The supermarket contains corn in layers. Visible corn, invisible corn, corn one step away. Corn several steps away, and then we reach the soft drinks again in our minds. Because high fructose corn syrup deserves a little more attention. It has become one of the most famous corn-derived ingredients in modern American food history. Its rise was not the result of a single decision. It emerged from a combination of processing technology, agricultural abundance, sugar markets, government policy, manufacturing needs, and economics. Corn starch was plentiful. Industrial methods could transform it into sweet syrup. Food and beverage companies could use that syrup efficiently. Over time, it became common in many American soft drinks and processed foods. This changed the relationship between corn and sweetness. For thousands of years, corn had been associated mainly with grain. Now it could enter the dessert world without tasting like maize. That is a remarkable chemical trick. A person drinks something intensely sweet. The tongue reports sugar. The agricultural origin may be corn. No kernel remains. The field has become a sensation. This is the point where some discussions about modern food turn into battles. One side declares a single ingredient responsible for every problem. Another side dismisses every concern as exaggeration. History does not need either extreme. For our purposes, the interesting fact is simpler. Corn became one of the major raw materials of industrial sweetness. That alone represents an astonishing change. The ancient farmers who selected teosinte were not breeding a sweetener for bottled drinks. They were trying to produce reliable food. Thousands of years later, the same plant lineage enters a chemistry plant, is separated into starch, broken into glucose, partly converted into fructose, blended into beverages, placed in bottles, loaded onto trucks, and sold beneath artificial light. The path is so long that the beginning seems almost unrelated to the end. But the beginning is still there. A seed, a field, sunlight, water, harvest. The factory has not abolished agriculture. It has hidden it. The same is true of livestock feeding. Corn does not create meat from nothing. The animal performs that transformation. But industrial agriculture learns how to organize the transformation at tremendous scale. Feed mills combine ingredients according to precise formulas. Nutritionists calculate protein, energy, vitamins, minerals, and cost. Farmers and livestock companies monitor growth. Transport systems bring grain to animals and animals to processing facilities. Meat then travels outward towards cities. The supermarket receives the final package. The shopper sees only the last few feet of a journey that may stretch across several states. This is one reason modern consumers can feel detached from farming even while depending on farming more completely than any previous generation. The city resident may never touch soil, may never see corn harvested, may never stand beside cattle, may never enter a grain elevator, may never smell wet corn inside a processing plant. Yet breakfast, lunch, dinner, and the packaging around all three may connect that person to farms hundreds of miles away. Physical distance has grown, economic dependence has deepened. This would be astonishing enough if corn were a rare crop. It is not. Across the American Midwest, corn covers immense areas. In summer, fields stretch along highways for hours. To a driver, they can become monotonous. Green, 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 another field, another farmhouse, another grain elevator. After enough miles, the extraordinary becomes boring. That boredom is part of the story too. Human beings stop noticing what surrounds them. The same happened thousands of years ago in Mesoamerica. Once maize became ordinary, nobody needed to be amazed by it every morning. Modern America repeats the pattern on a grander scale. Corn is everywhere, therefore it becomes invisible. The supermarket completes the illusion. Here, abundance is arranged to look natural. Shelves are expected to be full. Milk should be cold, meat should be wrapped, fruit should be available beyond local seasons. Boxes should face forward. Drinks should appear in long, identical rows. If one product disappears for a few days, shoppers notice immediately. But the normal presence of thousands of products seems almost effortless. It is not effortless. Behind the shelf stands a chain. Farmers, seed companies, fertilizer producers, machinery manufacturers, truck drivers, rail workers, processors, feed mills, livestock operations, food factories, packaging plants, warehouses, distribution centers, retail workers, energy systems, finance, insurance, government policy, scientific research, weather, and soil. The supermarket is the visible tip of a very large machine. Corn is one of the fuels running through it. Sometimes literally, sometimes nutritionally, sometimes chemically, sometimes economically. The remarkable thing is how rarely the shopper needs to know. A person can spend an entire life benefiting from this system without learning how cornstarch is made. They do not need to understand cattle feed. They do not need to know why grain elevators stand beside railways. They do not need to know why certain sweeteners became economically attractive. The system works precisely because expertise has been divided. One person grows, another processes, another transports, another manufactures, another sells, another eats. Modern civilization is built on trusting strangers to perform invisible tasks. The ancient village had fewer strangers. It also had fewer choices. The supermarket offers abundance by making origin distant. And corn has become one of the best crops for surviving that distance. Now imagine holding a steak beneath the supermarket lights. Is it a cornfield? No, of course not. It is beef. An animal lived before this package existed. But if that animal was finished on a corn-rich feed ration, the cornfield contributed to the flesh. So perhaps the steak is partly a cornfield translated through an animal. Now pick up a bottle of soda. Is that a cornfield? Again, no. It is water, flavoring, sweetener, acid, carbonation, and other ingredients, depending on the product. But if the sweetener began as cornstarch, then part of that bottle is a cornfield translated through chemistry. Now the cereal box, that one may be easier. Some cereals are directly made from corn, others include corn-derived ingredients. The field has simply been translated through milling, cooking, shaping, and packaging. The more we ask this question, the stranger the store becomes. Perhaps the modern supermarket is not really divided into aisles. Perhaps it is divided into transformations. Field into grain, grain into starch, starch into syrup, grain into feed, feed into meat, germ into oil, starch into industrial material, corn into products, products into ordinary life. This is how corn changed the world without needing to remain visible. The crop did not conquer by forcing everyone to eat corn on the cob. It conquered by becoming useful to systems. And systems care less about appearance than function. Does the ingredient work? Can it be produced cheaply enough? Can it be transported? Can it be stored? Can it be standardized? Can the supply expand? Corn repeatedly answers yes. That answer brings us back, strangely, to teosinte. Imagine placing a hard little teosinte seed case beside a modern supermarket cart. The distance between them is almost absurd. The ancient plant grew in Mesoamerica. People slowly selected it. Generations turned it into maize. Civilizations built meals and meanings around it. Europeans carried it across the Atlantic. Poor households depended on it. Farmers fed animals with it. Frontier distillers turned it into whiskey. Railways carried it. Scientists bred hybrids. Mechanized farms covered enormous landscapes. Factories learned to split the kernel into useful parts. And now we stand beneath fluorescent lights, surrounded by its descendants and derivatives. The early cultivators could not have imagined a soft drink factory. They could not have imagined a feedlot. They could not have imagined a supermarket freezer humming in the middle of the night. But they would understand the first step. Choose the seed, plant it, wait. That humble act still lies beneath everything here. Even the most industrial product eventually returns to biology. A factory cannot manufacture cornstarch unless a plant first captures sunlight. A feed mill cannot formulate corn into animal diets unless someone grows the grain. A beverage company cannot use corn sweetener without the corn. The supermarket may hide the field, it cannot eliminate it. And this leads to a curious final thought as we push our cart toward the exit. Perhaps modern people do not eat less directly from the landscape. Perhaps the landscape has simply become harder to recognize. The field is still present in dinner. It is present through layers. A piece of beef may carry the memory of feed, a bottle of soda may carry the memory of starch, a cereal may carry the grain more openly. A package may carry industrial uses that reach back toward agriculture in ways almost no customer notices. The cornfield has entered modern life not as one food among many, but as a flexible source of calories, feed, sweetness, oil, starch, and industrial material. It has become less like an ingredient and more like a background condition. And background conditions are easy to forget. We pay attention to the object in front of us. The bottle, the package, the meal. We rarely see the acres behind it. The doors slide open again. Night air replaces the supermarket chill behind us. The shelves remain bright. Ahead of us, somewhere beyond highways and cities, the fields are dark. Corn leaves move beneath the wind. The crop that once had to disguise itself as whiskey to survive a bad road now travels through pipelines, tankers, freight cars, feed systems, factories, and national supply chains. It sweetens, it thickens, it fattens livestock, it becomes fuel. It becomes material, it becomes ordinary, and that ordinariness is perhaps its greatest achievement. But the story has one final turn, because after thousands of years of changing corn to suit human needs, humanity has begun changing far more than the plant. Roads have been built for it, factories have been designed around it, markets depend on it, livestock systems consume it, fuel policies can increase demand for it, research institutions study it, entire landscapes follow its yearly rhythm. Long ago, humans made a wild grass dependent upon people. Now it is worth asking a softer and stranger question. After everything we have built around corn, how dependent have people become upon it? To answer that, we must leave the supermarket behind and return one last time to the field. We drift onward now, from the bright supermarket shelves back toward the quiet field. The doors close behind us. The fluorescent light fades. The hum of refrigerators gives way to the softer sounds of night. Somewhere beyond the parking lot, beyond the highways and warehouses, beyond the rail lines and processing plants, corn is still growing. The field is almost dark. Rows stand in long bands beneath the evening sky. Leaves move against one another with a dry whisper. The air smells of soil, dust, and green plant matter cooling after a hot day. A moth passes through the beam of a distant light. Somewhere in the darkness, an insect repeats the same small sound again and again. It would be easy to believe that nothing has changed. A stalk is still a stalk. A kernel is still a kernel. The plant still depends on rain, warmth, soil, and sunlight. Yet everything around it has changed. The cornfield we are looking at now does not belong only to the kitchen. Part of the harvest may become livestock feed. Part may become starch. Part may become sweetener. Part may become oil. Part may be fermented into alcohol. Part may become fuel. Part may enter materials that never appear on a dinner plate at all. The crop has escaped the narrow category of food. And once that happened, the field became connected not only to hunger, but to energy, manufacturing, transport, packaging, chemistry, and the complicated question of what modern societies choose to do with land. One of the most striking examples is ethanol. The principle behind ethanol is ancient. Human beings have fermented plant sugars for a very long time. Grain becomes alcohol through the work of microorganisms. Distillation can concentrate it. For centuries, the result was understood mostly as drink, medicine, solvent, or industrial alcohol. Then the age of engines gave alcohol another possible identity: fuel. Corn contains starch. Starch can be broken down into sugars. Those sugars can be fermented. The resulting ethanol can be blended into gasoline and burned inside engines. The farmer's field can therefore become movement. A car passing along a highway may carry, inside its fuel tank, energy that began as sunlight falling on corn leaves. This is an extraordinary transformation. When viewed slowly, the sun rises over a field, the plant captures energy, kernels form, the crop is harvested, The grain travels to a processing plant, starch becomes sugar, sugar becomes alcohol, alcohol enters fuel. Fuel enters an engine. The engine carries a person to work. The old field has become motion, of course. No transformation is free. Growing corn requires land. It requires water in different amounts depending on place and season. It requires machinery. Modern cultivation often depends on fertilizer, fuel, transport, and large systems of storage and processing. Turning grain into ethanol requires additional energy and infrastructure. So the question is not simply whether corn can become fuel. It clearly can. The deeper question is how a society chooses to balance the many demands placed upon the same crop: food, feed, fuel, industry, exports, land use. These uses compete and overlap in ways that are rarely simple. A farmer may see a strong ethanol market as another buyer for the harvest. A livestock producer may see higher grain demand as a change in feed costs. A processor may see opportunity. A government may see energy policy. A town may see jobs. A consumer may never think about any of it while filling a fuel tank. The same kernel has different meanings depending on who is holding the ledger. This has been true throughout our story. For the ancient farmer, corn meant survival. For the European peasant, it could mean a full bowl. For the frontier distiller, it meant portable value. For the livestock farmer, it meant feed. For the industrial chemist, it meant starch. For the fuel producer, it means fermentable material. Corn has never had a single history. It has had many histories layered on top of one another. The modern field carries all of them at once. And ethanol is only one branch. Corn has also entered the world of materials. Industrial chemistry can use sugars derived from corn to make substances that are then turned into certain kinds of bioplastics. The word bioplastic sounds almost futuristic, but the underlying idea is familiar. Take carbon that a plant pulled from the air. Use biological and chemical processes to rearrange it, create a material. In some applications, corn-derived feedstocks can help produce plastics designed for packaging, cups, films, utensils, or other uses. Again, the result no longer resembles the field. A transparent cup does not look like a stalk of maize. A thin piece of packaging does not smell like harvest. The crop has become almost conceptually invisible, and that invisibility can create misunderstandings. The word plant-based can sound as though a material simply grew from the ground in its final shape. It did not. There are factories between field and product, energy between field and product, machines, workers, transport, refining, design, industrial decisions. The corn provides raw material. Human systems provide transformation. That distinction matters because modern corn is never only a plant. It is a plant surrounded by infrastructure. Drive through agricultural country, and the infrastructure may not be obvious at first. The field dominates the view. But look more carefully. There is a road wide enough for trucks. A grain elevator rises near the horizon. A rail spur crosses the landscape. A fertilizer dealer operates near town. A machinery dealership stands beside a highway. A processing facility sits farther away. A seed company has representatives working across the region. Banks understand farm credit. Insurance companies understand crop risk. Universities run agricultural research. Weather forecasts are watched with unusual seriousness. Commodity prices move across screens. The crop may grow in soil, but the system surrounding it is made from finance, steel, fuel, policy, science, and information. This is how dependence becomes difficult to see. A city does not need to grow corn in order to depend on corn. A factory does not need to own farmland in order to depend on harvests. A supermarket does not need a silo behind the building in order to depend on grain markets. Modern life specializes. The field is far away. Its influence is close. This becomes clearest through animal feed. We met the pig beside the wooden trough centuries ago. The basic relationship has not disappeared. It has expanded. Corn remains a major feed grain in many modern livestock systems, especially in the United States. Pigs consume formulated feed. Poultry consumes formulated feed. Cattle in certain finishing systems consume grain-rich diets that can include substantial amounts of corn. Feed mills now perform with precision what the old farmer once did by instinct and experience. Ingredients are weighed. Nutrient levels are calculated. Rations are designed according to the animal, stage of growth, production goal, cost, and available ingredients. Corn brings energy. Other ingredients bring protein, minerals, vitamins, fiber, or other nutritional needs. The animal eats the formula. Then another transformation begins. Feed becomes eggs. Feed becomes milk. Feed becomes meat. The cornfield enters human diets through an animal intermediary. This means that demand for meat can become demand for grain. A person ordering chicken in a city may unknowingly participate in decisions about what is planted hundreds of miles away. A restaurant menu can reach backward toward farmland. A supermarket meat case can influence grain markets. The relationship is indirect, but indirect relationships can be powerful. Modern civilization is full of them. We rarely see the power station when turning on a lamp. We rarely see the reservoir when opening a tap. We rarely see the field when opening a package. The system works at a distance, and distance makes dependence feel like independence. This may be one of corn's greatest modern illusions. We think we have moved beyond the field because we no longer stand inside it. But the field has followed us into the car, into the supermarket, into the restaurant, into industrial materials, into livestock, into trade, into energy policy, into the price of land, into the decisions of farmers planning what to plant next spring. The old crop has become one of the quiet foundations of systems far larger than any household. And that raises a question that ancient farmers never needed to ask at this scale. What should a field be for? The simplest answer is food, but even that answer divides quickly. Food for whom? Humans directly? Animals that humans will later eat? Industrial ingredients used in food manufacturing? Should some of the crop become fuel? Should some become export? Should some land grow something else? Should productivity be pushed as high as possible? Should soil health receive more attention even if short-term yield changes? These are not questions with one timeless answer. Different communities answer them differently. Different decades answer them differently. Markets change, technologies change, governments change, weather changes, energy prices change. Consumer demand changes. The corn remains waiting for instructions. That is worth remembering. The plant does not choose to become ethanol. It does not choose to become cattle feed. It does not choose to become syrup, starch, oil, packaging, whiskey, or polenta. Human institutions make those decisions. A stalk standing in a field contains possibilities. Economics decides which possibility becomes real, and economics itself is built from human choices. This keeps the history grounded. It would be easy to say that corn conquered the modern world by itself. That would make a dramatic story, but plants do not build refineries. They do not write agricultural policy. They do not buy combines. They do not choose diets. They do not construct feedlots. People do. The real story is stranger. Human beings kept discovering more things corn could do. Then they built systems to do those things at scale. Once built, those systems began creating their own momentum. A processing plant needs grain. A feed mill needs grain. An ethanol facility needs grain. A livestock operation needs feed. A farmer with specialized equipment needs enough acreage to justify the machinery. A seed company needs customers. A railway needs freight. A commodity market needs supply. Each piece fits with another. The field becomes surrounded by demand. And this is how a plant can begin to feel as though it has conquered its cultivators without possessing any intention at all. The conquest is made of convenience. Corn works. It yields heavily under suitable conditions. It stores well. It travels, it can be processed, it can feed animals, its starch can be transformed, its sugars can be fermented, its oil can be extracted, its components can enter industry. Every useful property becomes another reason to keep growing it. Then growing it creates more infrastructure. More infrastructure creates more reasons to use it. The circle closes. Humans shape corn. Corn shapes markets. Markets shape farms. Farms shape landscapes. Landscapes shape communities. Communities build their lives around the system. Then the system begins to look natural. This is where our journey must begin, turning back toward its oldest point. Away from fuel pumps. Away from processing plants. Away from refrigerated aisles. Away from railways. Away from grain elevators. away from the enormous modern field, back toward a much smaller plant. Teosinte. Imagine it again. Thin branches, small seed cases, hard kernels. Nothing about it suggests endless Midwestern rows. Nothing suggests ethanol tanks. Nothing suggests cattle feed, breakfast cereal, paper coatings, sweeteners, industrial starch, whiskey barrels, or supermarket shelves. If someone did not know the history, they might struggle to believe that this wild grass and modern maize belong to the same long family story. Yet they do. Thousands of years ago, farmers in what is now Mexico began choosing, not once, not through a single brilliant invention, through repetition, a seed from this plant, not that one, a slightly larger ear, a more useful structure, a trait worth keeping. Plant it again, wait, observe, choose again. Generation followed generation. People slowly changed the plant until it became something increasingly dependent on human cultivation. Modern maize is poor at simply scattering itself and returning to a wild life. Its kernels remain attached to the cob. Its success depends heavily on people harvesting, selecting, transporting, and planting it. From one point of view, this makes corn one of humanity's great domestic victories. A wild grass was transformed into one of the world's great crops. But now turn the picture around. What did humanity build in return? Fields, storage, roads, markets, mills, railways, research stations, seed businesses, farm machinery, feed systems, processing plants, sweetener plants, ethanol facilities, livestock operations, export terminals, commodity exchanges, food factories, supermarkets, entire regional economies, entire cultural landscapes. Human beings made corn dependent on us. Then, gradually, we built a world in which many of our own systems depend on corn. This does not mean humanity would collapse tomorrow if one crop vanished completely. Agriculture is diverse. Food systems contain many grains and many sources of energy and material. People adapt, markets shift, farmers change crops. Technology finds substitutes. History is full of substitution. But the difficulty of replacing corn in all its roles at once reveals how deeply it has entered modern systems. Replace it as animal feed. Replace it as starch. Replace it as sweetener. Replace it as ethanol feedstock. Replace it as industrial raw material. Replace the income it provides farmers. Replace the demand supporting rural processing facilities. Replace the export flows. Replace the machinery and knowledge optimized around its cultivation. The list grows quickly. Dependence hides inside usefulness. That is the final twist. Corn did not conquer humanity by force, it conquered by becoming helpful. This is how many deep dependencies begin, not with coercion, with convenience. A tool proves useful, a crop performs well. A system grows around it. Then one day the system is large enough that removing the useful thing becomes very difficult. Corn has no plan. It does not need one. Evolution does not require intention. Markets do not require a crop to understand them. The plant simply offers traits that human systems reward: high productivity, stored energy, flexible chemistry, useful feed value, adaptability to industrial processing. And humans respond: more acres, more research, more machinery. More processing, more demand. A plant that cannot spread its own kernels effectively across a wild landscape has somehow managed to spread across human civilization, not by walking, by making us carry it. There is something almost poetic in that. Teosinte once scattered its own seeds. Domesticated maize lost much of that independence. We thought this meant the plant had surrendered itself completely to human control. Yet once corn became valuable enough, people carried it farther than any natural seed mechanism ever could. Across mountains, across oceans, across continents, into climates where its wild ancestor never grew, onto ships, into rail cars, into trucks, into silos, into factories, into laboratories, into seed banks, into markets. Humans became the dispersal system. The plant no longer needed to throw seeds into the wind. It had us. Of course, saying that corn used humanity would give the plant intentions it does not possess. But as a historical image, it is difficult to resist. A species gives up some independence. In exchange, another species spreads it across the world. The bargain is accidental. The result is astonishing. And perhaps this is the best place to return to the people who began it all. The early cultivators of maize were not primitive figures waiting for history to begin. They were active participants in one of the greatest biological transformations human beings ever achieved. They observed, selected, experimented, adapted, passed knowledge through families and communities, developed ways to prepare maize safely and efficiently, integrated it with other crops, built cuisines around it, built rituals around it, built stories around it. They understood something modern industrial civilization sometimes forgets. A crop is not only a thing, it is a relationship. The seed relates to soil, the farmer relates to weather, the cook relates to the grain, the community relates to the harvest. Knowledge connects all of them. When corn moved around the world, those relationships changed. Europe took the crop and sometimes missed the old preparation knowledge. Frontier America turned it into portable wealth. Industrial America turned it into feed and commodity. Scientists turned it into fractions. Manufacturers turned those fractions into ingredients. Energy systems turned starch into fuel. Modern society multiplied the relationships until corn became almost impossible to see as a whole. Now, at the end of our journey, we can see the entire shape again, a wild grass. A farmer's hand, a saved seed, a field, a village, a civilization, a ship, a poor cottage, a pig trough, a whiskey barrel, a railway car, a grain elevator, a hybrid seed bag, a factory pipe, a supermarket bottle, a fuel tank. Then the field again. The circle closes. Night settles more deeply now. The last color is leaving the horizon. The corn rows have become dark lines. A light glows from a farmhouse far away. The machinery is silent for the evening. No engines move through the field, no trucks arrive, no economists calculate. No chemists separate starch, no merchants watch prices. For a few hours, the enormous system disappears from sight. There are only plants. Their leaves move in the wind. The sound is soft and repetitive, almost like rain. It is the same basic sound people might have heard beside maize fields centuries ago. Not identical. The plants are different. The farms are different. The world is different. But the wind remains remarkably uninterested in economic history. It passes through the leaves. They answer somewhere inside each ear are kernels that could become many things. Seed, feed, food, starch, oil, sweetener, alcohol, fuel, industrial material. The future of each kernel depends not on what the plant intends, but on where the harvest is sent, and that may be the final lesson of corn. Human beings domesticated it. We changed its body. We chose which seeds would continue. We carried it beyond its ancient homeland. We turned it into one of the most productive crops on earth. But during that same long process, corn changed us. It changed what farmers planted. It changed what poor families ate. It changed what livestock consumed. It changed what frontier communities traded. It changed how railways and markets handled grain. It changed agricultural science. It changed industrial food. It changed the ingredients inside ordinary products. It entered arguments about energy and land. It helped shape landscapes so vast that a traveler can drive for hours through its descendants. We domesticated corn. And in the quietest possible sense, corn helped domesticate our world around itself. Not through command, through usefulness, not through conquest, through dependence. No crown was placed on its stalk. No army marched beneath its banner. No monument was built where the first farmer saved the first promising seed. There was only repetition. Plant, harvest, choose. Plant again. The same humble rhythm that began before written history continued long enough to reshape civilization. Now the field is almost invisible in the darkness. Only the nearest leaves catch a little light. Beyond them are rows we can no longer see. They continue into the night. There are no kings here, no battles, no speeches. No marble statues, only soil beneath our feet and the faint movement of plants descended from a small wild grass that most people today would probably walk past without noticing, and perhaps that is why its story feels so strange. The world is often changed by the things we notice least. A seed in a hand, a meal in a bowl, a sack in a warehouse, a kernel dropped into a trough, a farmer waking before dawn, a worker loading a train, a chemist watching liquid move through a pipe, a shopper lifting a bottle from a shelf. Small acts, ordinary acts, repeated until they become civilization. The corn leaves whisper again, then the wind weakens. The field grows still, and somewhere in the dark soil, the long partnership waits for another season.